Chapter 1, Ned I. Disclaimer, standard stuff. I don't own the rights to any of this, it all belongs to GRM and whichever companies own the rights to his work. I'm not making any money off of this fanfiction. /N, the Stark and Baratheon kids are all 1 to 2 years older than in the books. At the start of this, Robb and Jon are 15, Sansa is 12, Arya is 10, Bran is 8 and Rickon is 3. Joffrey is 13, Myrcella is 9, and Tommen is 8. Ned. Amongst the blind stone eyes of the long-dead Starks, Ned kneeled before his king. "Your Grace, I am not worthy of the honor," Ned said, bowing his head. He gazed at the stone beneath their feet, worn from centuries of being walked on, even if it was only on the rare occasion. "If I wanted to honor you, I'd let you retire. I'm planning on letting you run the kingdom and fight the wars while I eat, drink, and wench myself into an early grave," Robert said in amusement. "Robert Baratheon sitting out a war, that will be the day," Ned replied, lifting his head up enough to look at Robert, a small grin on his face. "Ha! I do love a good fight. Haven't had one since, my gods, was it Pike? How long ago was that?" 9 years, Ned answered, remembering the last time they took up arms together, to put an end to Balon Greyjoy's little rebellion. It had been almost a decade since they had last seen each other, and time changed all things eventually. Many things were different, including the king's waistline, which had ballooned greatly. 9 years. How the time passes. Robert took notice of Ned's posture. "Up now, I won't have you kneel before me like that. The others can bow and scrape all they want, but not you. Never you." Ned slowly climbed to his feet. Standing at his full height, Robert still towered over him by almost half a foot. The weight he put on may have robbed Robert of his imposing figure, the one that used to terrify opposing soldiers on the battlefield, but Ned could see the man he had been under all that weight. And it wasn't just the extra girth Ned was referring to, it was the weight of that crown that sat heavy upon the king's head. "You helped me win this damnable throne, now help me hold it. We were meant to rule together. If Lyanna had lived, we should have been brothers, bound by blood as well as affection. Well, it is not too late. I have a son, you have a daughter. My Joff and your Sansa shall join our houses as Lyanna and I might once have done." Ned was taken aback by the offer. Now that was surprising. Being offered the position of hand had been expected. Why else would Robert make the trip all the way to Winterfell? He had wrestled with himself over the past several nights, as he waited for Robert to arrive at his family home, if he would accept the position or not. After many talks with Cat, he had decided to take the position, to join his friend in ruling the land they had won all those years ago, despite everything in him wanting to say no. But a betrothal proposal between their families. Ned winced. "What?" Robert demanded upon seeing his face. The king's eyes narrowed, his blue eyes glinting with the fiery temper Ned remembered from their youth. The one that had frightened all those who had stood before his fury, before Robert had calmed enough to settle tensions with his wide smile and booming laughter. "Sansa is already betrothed, your grace." "To whom?" "Brynden Blackwood, heir to Raventree Hall. My good father arranged it several months ago." Robert took that information in and seemed to mull it over. If Ned still knew the king as well as he used to all those years ago, he knew the man was judging if it would be worth demanding Ned break the betrothal. He could order it so, as the king, and Ned would be forced to obey, but Ned hoped he would not push the issue. It would anger not only Lord Blackwood, who would feel like Ned was spurning his family and declaring them not good enough to marry his daughter, but it would also spurn Hoster Tully, who had worked tirelessly to arrange a suitable match between his granddaughter and one of his strongest vassals, a vassal who worshipped the old gods but was also much closer to the kind of Southron court Sansa dreamed of being a part of. House Tully's grasp on the Riverlands was always weak, as several of their vassals were stronger houses, who could raise more levies and held more land. It was one of the reasons Hoster Tully had betrothed Catelyn to Ned's older brother Brandon, and Lysa to the older Jon Arryn, 2 of the major 7 houses. While his good brother Edmure was of age to marry, the young man had refused all requests from his father to do so despite the older man's pleading, and so Hoster had looked to his oldest, Cat, and her family to help strengthen his bonds with his vassal lords. Ned, having already worked to strengthen his own alliances with his lords in the north, had seen the benefit in marrying Sansa to the heir of a powerful Riverlands house, to also further the bonds between House Stark and the Riverlands. All right then, your other daughter. Ned winced again. Robert's nostrils flared in anger. Another damn betrothal, the king boomed, the sound echoing off the statues of Ned's ancestors. No, your grace. I'm just thinking of Arya's reaction if I tell her she's to be betrothed. Arya is just. Ned looked back deeper into the crypts, where they had been moments earlier. She's like her aunt come back to life. Robert followed Ned's gaze and then understanding entered his eyes. His anger faded and he gave a low chuckle. She's a she-wolf. She wrestles with her brothers, races her horse against the guardsmen, and tries to sneak in on the boys' sword training. Every time we put her in a dress, it ends up torn and covered in mud. She runs from needlework and drives both her mother, and the Septa who tries to teach her how to be a lady, mad. Like Lyanna, Robert said, a wistful note in his voice. Robert rubbed at his chin, his fingers disappearing in the thick, wiry beard. Joff is, to my dismay, too much like his mother. If the betrothal was between him and Arya, I imagine they'd likely kill each other. And Tommen, he's a sweet kid. He doesn't have the deposition for a she-wolf yet. Tommen and Arya are still young, your grace, Ned pointed out. She is only 10, and how old is Tommen? He is 8. Robert thought it over. Fine, in 3 years we'll revisit this conversation. See how the years have changed our children. You'll be the first one we come to when discussing Arya's betrothal possibilities, Ned promised, face solemn, his honor binding him to his spoken words. I damn well better be. Robert cried, clapping Ned on the back so hard that Lord Stark stumbled forward. Your letters said you had 3 true-born sons, but I saw only the 2. Where is your other boy? Bran has been at Runestone in the Vale, your grace. Despite being of the old gods, he wishes to become a knight, a member of the Kingsguard even. He's the page for Sir Robar Royce. He should be here in another day or so, your grace. Stop with the your grace shit or I swear I'll knock your head clean off your shoulders, Robert stated, jabbing Ned in the chest. As you wish, your Robert, Ned corrected. Sir Robar is a fine knight, if young. I've seen him in some tourneys. His footwork is a bit sloppy. Jon spoke highly of his son when he was here years past. If your boy grows into a fine warrior, I'll be honored to have him in my Kingsguard. Ned dipped his head in appreciation. He would be eternally grateful to his friend if he made Bran's dreams come true. Robert was back to rubbing his chin. Those years we were at the Eyrie together were the best years of my life. This fostering, with your sons, have you had any issues with it? Ned's eyebrows rose at the question. Coming back to the north after winning a war, his mind had still been on strategy and tactics. He had written a list of things he wanted to do to strengthen the north, a list that he had slowly been working on throughout the years, and strengthening the alliances with his most powerful northern vassals had been one of them. The lords had been loyal to his father, and they had spent years getting to know Brandon as the future ruler of Winterfell while Ned had been away for years in the Vale. They had followed him to war, but that had been for vengeance of his father and brother, not for love of Ned. He had been reluctant to send Robb and Jon away, especially after losing all but his brother Benjen to the Targaryens, but in the end he knew it needed to be done. And it had helped that Sansa, Arya, and Bran had all been around to ease the temporary loss. Outside of missing my children, no. Robb was with the Karstarks at Carhold for almost 5 years, and Jon with the Umbers at Last Hearth for the same. I'm indebted to the teaching both lords have done for them. They've both made friends with the heirs and sons of my vassals, and have further strengthened our alliances. And Bran has written about how much he's learning about what it takes to be a knight. Robert stared at something over Ned's shoulder, searching for something that wasn't there. He closed his eyes and let out a tired sigh. I didn't do it with Joffrey. I'm told there's an unwritten rule about not fostering the heir to the realm, or so Cersei says, but like I said, he's too much like his mother. For the sake of my other children, and my own damn sanity, I can't let the same happen to Tommen and Myrcella. I was thinking of fostering them both. Get them away from their mother for a few years. Though I don't know where to send them. I could help you choose where to send them. No lord will turn away fostering a prince and princess of the realm. When we're at King's Landing you can help me choose. Robert let out a long breath that spoke of future suffering. I'm going to get hell from Cersei when she finds out I'm sending them away, but it needs to be done. Oh, she'll demand I at least send them to Casterly Rock with her father, But that is not an option. They are already two. Lannister, why? Ned chuckled. No one said you had to marry one. Jon wouldn't shut up about it, Robert muttered, referring to their foster father. You were off relieving the siege of Storm's End, so you didn't hear it. Her father gave you King's Landing. The Lannisters are a powerful family. Robert rolled his eyes. I only agreed when word came of your sister. Whatever potential there might have been for my marriage with Cersei never had a chance. Lyanna's shade has hung over me since her passing. Robert's face darkened with bitter memories. After a moment he shook his head and looked around them. It seemed he had forgotten where they had been. Ned wondered how much time had passed since they had first descended into the crypts of Winterfell. Let's get out of this damp and dark place. There's food and drink waiting and I plan to indulge in both. Ned rolled off Cat later that night, and like he had done hundreds of times before, he walked to the windows of the room. He pulled back the heavy tapestries and threw open the windows, letting the cool night caress his heated skin. He let out a content sigh. Cat's room was the hottest room in Winterfell, one of the reasons it was hers, and the heat of it always became too much for him to bear, especially after a night of love-making. With his appetite sated, in more ways than one, he found his mind drifting to a few hours ago, back when he had stood before the king and accepted his offer of becoming his hand. I should have refused him, Ned said, his voice thick with doubt as he turned to look at his wife. In the morning I will tell him I have changed my mind. I cannot go south. You could not, Cat said. You must not. My duties are here in the north. I still have many things I need to do here. Things I promised myself I would do when the war was over 16 years ago. He is your king. You cannot refuse him. You especially cannot tell him no after agreeing to at first. Ned shook his head. Robert is like a brother to me. He will understand. Robert Baratheon is a king and has been for 16 years, Cat reminded him. Kings do not hear the word no often from their subjects. He's not the child you grew up with in the Eyrie and he's not the teen you fought a war with. When a king commands you, you obey. He came all this way to bestow this honor upon you. You cannot spurn him. Honor? Ned asked with a forced laugh. Starks do not do well in the south, my father and brother and sister can all attest to that. And King's Landing is like a pit of adders. Whatever Cat was going to say in response was interrupted by an urgent knock on the door. Ned growled, the sound coming from low in his throat and sounding almost wolf-like. He moved closer to the door. What is it? My Lord Desmond, one of the house guards, called through the door. Maester Lewin is without and begs urgent audience. Did you tell him I instructed not to be disturbed? I did, my lord, but he said it could not wait. Ned growled again. He moved to the wardrobe and took out a heavy robe that he threw upon his shoulders. Very well, send him in. Cat pulled the furs and blankets up to her chin. Perhaps we can close the windows. Ned gave a distracted nod and moved to the windows as the maester entered the room. His wife could never stand to have the windows open long, even in the summer months. One would think after 16 years in the north she would have gotten used to the chill, but it seemed her body still clung to the southern warmth. Maester Lewin was a small grey man. His eyes were grey, his hair, what little he had left of it, was grey, and the robes he wore were grey. My lord, Maester Lewin said, as soon as the door closed. Pardon for disturbing your rest. I have been left a message. Left by whom? And what does this have to do with me? Ned asked with irritation as he pulled shut the last window. I do not know who left it, my lord. I awoke from my nap to see someone had left a carved wooden box on a table in my observatory. My servants saw no one, but it must have been left by someone in the king's party. We have had no other visitors. A wooden box, you say? Catelyn asked. Ned frowned. He had little patience for these kinds of things. His preference was straight and to the point, not this roundabout way. So someone had left the maester a box. Why was this such an urgent thing? Inside was a fine new lens for my observatory. It looked like it came from MYR. Fine lens crafters do work their craft in MYR. Lewin, speak plainly. What does this have to do with me? That is a very good question to ask, my lord. I found the true message in a hidden compartment at the bottom of the box. Maester Lewin reached into his grey robe and pulled out a tightly rolled scrap of parchment. It was sealed with blue wax. A lens is an instrument to see, Cat stated. So what is it they want us to see? Perhaps this message will shed more light, Lewin said, turning the rolled paper over in his fingers. Give it here then, Ned said, holding out his hand. My apologies, my lord, but this letter was not addressed to you. It is addressed to Lady Caitlin. Ned looked at his wife, who shivered under the furs of her bed, despite the fact that he had closed the windows. She dropped the furs, and rose from the bed, and Ned wondered if she had forgotten her nakedness. Maester Lewin averted his eyes. Cat, he warned, nodding at her form. She looked down at herself before shaking her head. Maester Lewin has delivered all of my children. There is no time for false modesty. Cat moved to the wardrobe and also withdrew a robe, which she placed around her shoulders. She pulled the robe tight against herself, tying it off at the waist. Once clothed, she moved to the Maester and took the message from him. The Maester moved to leave the room. I shall leave you. No, Ned interrupted. Stay, we might have need of your counsel. Cat opened the seal and her eyebrows went up. It's from my sister, Lysa. Ned looked at the message over her shoulder, but it read like nonsense to him. How can you tell? When we were girls, we created our own secret language, just between us two, so we could pass notes without anyone being the wiser to what we were saying. It has been many years since then, but I can still understand it. Cat continued to read, her hand moving up to her mouth in surprise. Lysa believes her husband was murdered. Ned felt a series of emotions rise up in him at those words. Jon Arryn had been a second father to him. He had raised his banner in rebellion rather than turn over two teenagers to the Mad King, saving both his and Robert's lives. That someone would murder such an honorable man like that. Is she sure? That is her belief. She has fled King's Landing for the Eyrie. Ned, she accuses the Lannisters of being behind the murder, she accuses the Queen. Ned's mind took a moment to process what his wife had just said. Her sister was accusing the Queen of murdering the Hand of the King. Was that something she would even be capable of? Ned remembered the look on Tywin Lannister's face when he presented the mutilated bodies of Princess Elia and her two children. If the Queen took after her father, then she was more than capable of killing a man. Could Lady Lysa be imagining things in her grief? Maester Lewin asked. There have been well-documented cases of such things happening. Cat shook her head. No, I know my sister. These aren't grief-stricken accusations. This message was carefully planned, cleverly hidden. She knew it meant her death if it was discovered by the wrong person. Ned ran his hand down his face and closed his eyes. By the old gods, why would the Queen murder Jon Arryn? What could possibly drive her to do something like that? Then it looks as though I truly am needed in King's Landing. Ned frowned, not liking this one bit. For the safety of the man I consider a brother. The Hand of the King has great power, my lord. Power to find the truth of Lord Arryn's death. Power to bring his killers to justice. And power to protect Lady Arryn and her son, should the worst be true. Ned stared out the window, to the Godswood, where he could see the top of the heart tree with its canopy of red leaves. My father went south once, to answer the summons of a king, and he never returned. A different time, my lord, Maester Lewin said. And a different king. Yes, Ned said, lingering doubt evident in his tone. He took a seat by the hearth. Caitlin, you shall stay here in Winterfell. I am to stay? Cat asked, shocked. You would separate us so? Robb will rule as the Stark in Winterfell. He is 15 now, almost a man grown, but he does not truly know yet what it means to rule. He will need your counsel, and you, Maester Lewin. You have been a source of much wisdom, and I trust you like I trust my family. Thank you, Lord Stark. Serving your family has been an honor, Maester Lewin said, bowing low. I don't wish to be separate from you, Cat whispered. Nor I you, but it must be done. At least for a few years. What of the other children? Cat asked, a pained expression on her face. It had been hard on Cat when Robb had been sent to foster, and again when Bran was sent to Runestone to be a page. He knew she loved her children dearly and, as most mothers, did not want to be departed from them in their youth. Ned gathered his thoughts. Rickon is too young, he will stay with you. I will take Sansa with me. She has always wanted to see a Southron court. Well, now she will get to see the Southron court. You should take Arya as well. She must learn the way of a Southron court sooner or later if she is to wed. Ned shook his head. No. Arya is a she-wolf, like my sister was. The Southron ways are not her ways, and I fear she will act out more than usual in King's Landing. She will stay at Winterfell. Ned, if she is to marry a prince of the realm. Robert loved my sister, in spite of her ways. Really, I believe it was because she was so wild that Robert loved her so. Tommen is Robert's son, and I do not doubt that if he and Arya are meant to be, he will love her in spite of her she-wolf ways as well. Kat bit her lip, no doubt in worry over Arya. Bran would be travelling with Sir Robar as his page, Sansa would be accompanying him to King's Landing, and Robb, Arya, and Rickon would remain in Winterfell. That just left. You must take Jon with you. Ned winced, hoping Kat would forget about Jon, but it was not to be. The resentment she held for the boy was always present, it seemed. He and Robb are close. I had hoped. He can't stay here. I will not allow it. Take him to King's Landing and be done with it. You know I cannot take him south with me. A boy with a bastard's name at court. He will be shunned. Rumor is Robert has sired a dozen bastards himself. And none have ever been seen at court. Ned said, feeling the anger swell within himself. Jon will stay at Winterfell. No, if you are leaving then you must take the boy with you or send him off to Last Hearth again. The boy expressed interest in joining the Night's Watch. Mayor Stillowin supplied, no doubt trying to be helpful, though such news was anything but. Your lord brother told me the boy spoke with him about it at dinner tonight. Ned's face fell. Jon said that. Kat jumped on the idea. Yes. Send him with your brother to the Night's Watch. Jon is still a boy, Ned said with a shake of his head. The Night's Watch is a hard life. Jon doesn't realize what it entails. Benjen is his uncle, he will look after him. Let him take the vows, and give up any claims he might have. Ned knew Kat meant a claim on Winterfell. She viewed Jon as a threat to her true-born children, and despite his statements that it would never happen and his attempts to soothe her worries, it seemed she always would. No. Maybe in a few years, when he truly understands what being a brother of the Night's Watch means, he can join, but not right now. I will not allow. I am the Lord of Winterfell, Ned snapped, his anger getting the best of him. Kat shrank away from him. And if I say Jon is to stay here, then it is to be so, and I will hear not another word about it. Ned moved to the door and exited the room, without a glance at his wife. He already felt guilty at snapping at her, but he knew it was the only way he could get her to drop the issue without capitulating to her demands. While he might not be Kat's, Jon was his family and he would not banish him to the wall at such a young age. Mayor Stillowin dutifully followed him out, closing the door behind him. Mayor Stillowin, tomorrow after he breaks his fast, have Robb come to my solar. We have much to discuss if he is to be the Stark in Winterfell. Chapter 2, Robb I. Robb. Robb rapped his knuckles against the heavy wooden door. Come in, his father's muffled voice called to him. Robb, with Grey Wind at his side, entered into his father's solar, a room he had not been in too often while growing up. Once he had been old enough, the day after his 5th Name-a-day, he had various lessons and training occupying most of his days. Then he had turned 10 and he had been sent north to Carhold to foster with the Karstarks, who took over his lessons and training for 5 years. A wooden table sat in the middle of the room with several chairs around it. Hanging from one of the walls was a detailed map of the north drawn with great detail on the dried skin of an auroch. There were 3 large bookcases filled with leather-bound books, and various chests and cabinets that held stacks of parchment, trinkets, and other items. The sole window in the room overlooked the Godswood, and another door led directly to the Lord of Winterfell's bedroom, his father's bedroom. His father was sitting at the head of the table, a worn piece of parchment the only thing in front of him. Mayor Stillowin said you wanted to see me, Robb said, stepping into the room. I did. Close the door behind you and have a seat. Robb did as asked and took a seat near his father. Grey Wind laid down with a huff, sprawling over Robb's feet. He tried to recall yesterday after the king arrived if he had done anything that would cause his father to call him to his solar like this, but nothing came to mind. He had been polite with the royal family, and had escorted young Myrcella to their dinner table with perfect manners, just as his mother taught him. He laughed when one of the royal family members made a joke, even if it wasn't a good one, and made polite conversation. He had even danced with the princess when a tune had been struck, leading the younger girl across the dance floor in the steps of the traditional Cayley dance of the first men that every man, woman, and child in the north knew, but only few in the south had witnessed. "The king has asked me to be his hand and I have accepted," his father said, turning his grey eyes to look at his son. Rob's eyebrows went up. He had finished his fostering at Carhold a few turns of the moon ago, and had looked forward to showing to his father how much he had grown and how much he had learned while away. Yet it seemed the old gods had other plans, for after being so shortly reunited with his father, they would be separated again. "You're leaving?" "Not for another couple of se'nights, but yes. I will go to King's Landing and will be taking Sansa with me." Rob imagined that would please Sansa and her childhood fantasies of the southern lifestyle, away from the cold and harsher living of the north. She'd have the chance to hear more of those songs she liked to hear of true knights and their loves. So different from the songs commonly sung in the north that were more cautionary tales with lessons to be learned if you listened close enough to the lyrics. His father was another story. "Starks don't do well in the south" was a saying he often heard his father state when declining invitations to travel below the neck and into the other 6 kingdoms, invitations to visit his good family at Riverrun, or visit his foster father and foster brother in the capital. "That means," Ned continued, "a few things for you. The first is that I have sent a raven to Lord Marndale asking to move up your wedding ceremony with his granddaughter. I know we were going to wait until your 16th name day, but I would like to see my son married before I leave." Rob felt heat rise up his neck and spread across his cheeks. Despite the constant teasing from Theon and Jon, he had been trying not to think of his upcoming marriage that had just a few moments ago been a few turns of the moon away. Though now, with the stroke of a pen and the flap of a raven's wings, it seemed to be only 3 to 4 se'nights away. Winifred was a year older than him, and he thought her one of the prettiest girls he had ever seen. When they had first met, the fact that she was the granddaughter of Lord Too Fat to Sit a Horse, and the daughter of his equally large son, had baffled him. How could one so petite be related to one so large? He knew a lot was to be expected of their union. Not only did he need to produce a son to succeed him in taking over Winterfell, however many years into the future that would be, but he needed to have a second son to take on the name Marndale, to be Sir Williser and the eventual Lord of White Harbour, the North's only city and port. "The second is that in my absence you will be the Stark in Winterfell. The North will be yours to rule, though your mother and Maester Lewin will be here to provide you counsel, and I will always be a raven away should you have need. I thought I would have more time to teach you what it meant to be the Warden of the North, but fate has decreed otherwise. We will start your education today, so that when I leave you have the basics of understanding, and we will start it with this." His father picked up the piece of parchment in front of him and held it out to Rob. He took the piece of parchment and looked it over. It was a list of things, some of which were crossed out. "When I came back from the war, I realized that the North had been left weak. My father had turned his ambitions south in attempts to create alliances between the powerful houses, betrothing Brandon to House Tully and Lyanna to House Baratheon, and neglected much in the North. Neither my grandfather nor my great-grandfather did anything to strengthen the North either. That meant almost a century went by of the North's power withering away. House Stark is only as strong as the North is, so I set goals to strengthen it." Rob looked at the first thing on the list, which had been crossed off: strengthen alliances with powerful houses. "You fostered me with the Karstarks," Rob said, catching on to his father's thought process. "And betrothed me to Lord Marndale's granddaughter. And fostered Jon with the Umbers. 3 of the strongest houses in the North. I gifted the new keep in the Rills to the second son of House Ryswell, increasing House Ryswell's loyalty and making its new cadet branch staunch supporters. And I made Lord Tallheart's brother the steward of Moat Cailin." "What about the Boltons, aren't they the strongest after us?" Rob asked. "Why exclude them?" Ned grimaced at the mention of the Boltons. "There is too much bad blood between the Starks and the Boltons. I had thought of betrothing Sansa to Roose Ser Domeric, who I heard good things about from his time as Lord Redfort's squire, but I could not bring myself to do it, knowing what I do of that family's history. The lad ended up dying at the start of the new year, so it would have been moot anyway. Next on the list was rebuild Moat Cailin. Rob had seen Moat Cailin twice as a young boy, when he had travelled with his mother to Riverrun shortly after Arya was born, and then on the return journey. From what he remembered, it was 3 broken down towers that guarded the King's Road, the only proper path through the neck and into the north. His father had said 100 archers at Moat Cailin could hold off a Southron army of thousands if needed. He knew efforts had been made to rebuild the area and its defences, overseen by Leopold Tallheart. Leopold's role as steward of Moat Cailin was only a temporary endeavour, as Rob knew the plan was for one of his brothers to take over lordship of the area and start a new cadet branch of House Stark, like the Karstarks had once been and the Greystocks had been before they had been killed off after joining the Boltons in one of the many rebellions started by the Flayed Man. Third on the list was fix the King's Road, the second item on the list to be crossed off. It was followed by a similar connect the north by road, that was not crossed out. Fifth was strengthen the western coast and was accompanied by build new strongholds in the Rills, the Stony Shore, and Sea Dragon Point. The Rills was the only one that was crossed off. Finishing off the list was build a navy, repair and resettle abandoned keeps and holdfasts, strengthen the Night's Watch, and repair the broken tower. None of the final 4 were crossed off. Rob knew from personal experience that the broken tower was still broken as he saw it every day. "Dad, you haven't done anything," Rob cried, looking up from the list. After realizing what he said, he felt himself flush with embarrassment. Rather than be angry, his father laughed, eyes crinkling with the movement. It appears that way, doesn't it? Some of these have been worked on for years, and will likely take years more before they are finished. A road network connecting the entire north. That will be happening for another decade or 3. And the unfortunate truth is that things cost money. I cannot use all of Winterfell's wealth on these projects all at once, as it would drain our coffers, and so must be smart about which ones I choose to do at which times. Rob spent the rest of the morning listening to his father go over the plans that were actively taking place across the north under the guidance of House Stark, and what his expectations were to be in maintaining them. At Moat Cailin the Children's Tower and the Gatehouse Tower were both repaired, and the Drunkard's Tower, which got its name from its great lean, had been torn down before it collapsed on its own. 2 new towers had been built, including a twin to the Gatehouse Tower on the other side of the King's Road. A new wooden keep with stone foundations had gone up, replacing the one that had rotted centuries ago. Winterfell had also paid for the construction of an inn, a stable, and a smithy, the start of the town that would grow around the keep. Small folk had been attracted to the area north of the keep by the promises of a few acres of land to farm and call their own, but they were in charge of building their own houses, barns, livestock pens, etc. A curtain wall was in the process of being built to the south, across the causeway. A gate would then be built over the road, allowing them to shut off entry to the north if needed. There were also plans to surround the east, west, and northern sides of Moat Cailin with palisades, to offer additional protection in case their enemy arrived by ship on the coast, and to add another 2 towers, as records indicated there used to be 20, but those would likely have to wait several years as they were low down on the importance scale. Besides the King's Road, there had only been one other stone-laid road in the rest of the north, and that was the one connecting White Harbour to the King's Road as it left the shadow of Moat Cailin, because besides the Starks, only the Marndaelis could afford to build such a road. Roads made it easier for caravans to travel, and stone roads made travel easier than dirt. If House Stark wanted there to be an increase in trade in the north, they would have to make it easier for trade caravans and merchants to travel. So his father had paid for a road that had been built to last half from the King's Road, and was in the process of being extended to Carhold, a process that started over a year ago and would hopefully be finished shortly. It would be called the Last Road, after the river to its south. There was the hope of building a road from Carhold to the Dreadfort and from the Dreadfort to Winterfell, though his father's unease around Roose Bolton likely meant it would be years before talks of such a road started. There was a dirt path through the Wolf's Wood that went east from Winterfell to the Crofters village, then north to an abandoned crumbling tower that Bran had named Tumbledown Tower, and then northwest to Deepwood Motte. His father had provided the coin to Galbart Glover to start the process of turning it to a proper stone road starting at Deepwood Motte, and he had been planning to start on the Winterfell end in a few se'nights, with the goal to have the two sides meet somewhere in the middle of the Wolf's Wood. Now it would be one of the first things Robb would take over, the building of the Wolf's Road. Robb's future good father had been tasked with building and manning a series of longships to create the first Northern Navy since Brian the Burner had burned his father's fleet thousands of years ago. Wyman Marndale had eagerly accepted the task, and would be doing so with his own coin because operating his own navy brought him prestige and power no other Northern lord had. The latest report from Lord Marndale had said there were 10 longships and a galley already built, and he expected to double that in the next 2 years. It was the western coast his father was having difficulty on the navy front. The Mormonts had 2 longships to help ward off raids from wildlings and Ironborn, but they didn't have the population or the money to support any more ships. He had thought of the Glovers at Deepwood Motte, but they had the same problem as Bear Island, and the new keep his father had built in the rills on Blazewater Bay, and given to Rickard Riswell, second son of Lord Roderick Riswell, therefore creating a new Riswell cadet branch, was too new to have any type of money or large population at this point. And unfortunately the other endeavours of rebuilding Moat Cailin, repairing the King's Road, creating new stone roads to connect some of the major holdfasts, and building a new stone keep on the coast in the rills, had drained the Winterfell coffers, and with winter approaching in the next 3 or 4 years, it would be unwise to drain the coffers anymore by building a small navy to sail the Sunset Sea. Besides, the only threat in that direction had been the Iron Fleet, and it had been burned 9 years ago, and Balon Greyjoy had been forbidden from rebuilding it, lest he wanted to be sent the head of his only remaining son. There were others on the list that took a back seat to the more important ones, and would likely have to wait until spring came again before they could get started on, however many years that would be. Though strengthening the Night's Watch was something that could always be worked toward by sending new recruits and supplies that way. Though the ultimate goal was resettling the Gift with not only small folk but a few minor lords loyal to the Night's Watch. The resettling of the abandoned keeps and holdfasts was one of them. Robb had been shown on the map all the abandoned castles, keeps, and towers in the north, and it had been an extensive list: Queen's Crown, Farmbrook, Spire's Keep, Tumbledown Tower, Sea Dragon's Lair, Snowhold, Stafford, the White Tower, Broken Fort, Sheep's Head Keep, Horns Tower, Longhold, Seal's Hall, Wolf Mill, and the Knoll. And that said nothing of the dozens of smaller, wooden holdfasts in the area that had been abandoned over the years. The North needed people to populate the lands, but with winter approaching it would be difficult to convince the southern small folk to want to move north. Not to mention any boost to the population of the North during the summer was quickly depleted by those who froze to death or died from starvation in the years of winter. There was a loud knock on the door, and Ned bade the person to enter. The door was thrown open by Sir Aris O'Kert, before the King's Guard stepped back. The King entered the room, his girth filling the doorway as he passed through it. "Here you are," the King boomed, startling Grey Wind, who had fallen asleep sometime in the past few hours. "I've been looking for you half the morning." "My apologies, Robert. I've been teaching Robb here what it means to be Warden of the North, since I will be joining you in King's Landing. And it seems in doing so I've forgotten myself and have been a poor host." Robert waved his hand in the air. "Nonsense, you're doing your duties as a lord. Besides, your brother has seen fit to occupy my time with tales of how poorly the Night's Watch is doing. All these years and I forgot he's just as dull as you." "My brother does speak the truth," his father responded, ignoring the King's jest. "They only have 1,000 men, if that. Not enough to effectively guard 300 miles worth of wall." "Damn good thing you're the hand then," Robert said, with a smirk. "You can add helping the Night's Watch to all the other things you'll have to juggle." His father grimaced, likely knowing the truth of the King's words. "It is good you are here. I beg your pardon, but I will not be able to accompany you when you return to King's Landing. I will have to make the journey at a later time." "Oh. You aren't trying to pull a fast one on me, are you, Ned? Hoping I'll forget all about you agreeing if you don't come with us?" His father chuckled. "If only I was so lucky. No, Robb is to be married to Lord Marndale's eldest granddaughter. It was to be after his 16th name day, but I'd like to be here to see it. I've sent word to Lord Marndale with the request to move up the wedding to as soon as he can ride to Winterfell." "Congrats, lad," the King boomed again, slapping Robb on the back. Robb stumbled forward, not expecting the strength behind the King's hand. "Hopefully she doesn't take after her grandfather, if you know what I mean." Robb knew what the King meant. "No, your grace." "She's very pretty," Rob said with a blush. "Ha, good for you. Though I'll be the first to tell you beauty isn't always all it's cracked up to be in a woman." Rob wondered what the king meant by that. The queen was a beautiful woman, and it appeared her courtesy and elegance was a match for said beauty. "When was the last time you sparred, Robert?" his father asked, changing the subject as he eyed the king's stomach. The king followed his gaze, and patted his belly with his hands, a small grin on his face. "It's been some time, I admit." His father stepped forward, and gestured to the door the king had entered from, where Arisokurt still stood in his gleaming white armor. "Then come, let us see if the demon of the trident is still under all that added protection." Robert's laughter followed his father and the king as they went out the door and, likely, to the training yard. Rob had underestimated the king. Yes, he was a fat man who enjoyed his wine, but there was still a serious strength under all that added girth. Maybe it wasn't so hard to picture the man who he had just seen with the stories he had heard about the rebellion. Rob looked down at Grey Wind, who looked at him with a tilted head. "Let's go see what the others are up to." He found Theon in the inner ward where the archery range was, practicing with his yew bow while Sir Roderick barked at the newest guard recruits who were learning how to shoot a bow. The princes had been in the practice yard earlier in the morning to take lessons with Sir Roderick, but without anyone their own age, with Rob occupied with his father, John being a bastard and so kept away from the royal family, and Bran not yet arriving from the Vale. They hadn't practiced any meaningful sparring. "Have you seen the others?" Rob asked. Theon gave one of his patented half-shrugs. "Your sisters are likely with the Septa for embroidery lessons with the princess. No idea where Snow is." "Are you going to stay here practicing?" Rob asked. Theon confirmed that he would, as he notched another arrow. His relationship with Theon had cooled a bit since his fostering. The older boy had become a fast friend of his when he had first been brought to Winterfell as his father's ward. Rob had been 6 at the time and Theon 9. John and Theon had also become friends of a sort, though Rob knew the thing tying their friendship together was himself. However, after 4 years of Theon arriving, Rob and John had been sent off to foster and Theon had been left in Winterfell with the stable boys and the like to keep him company. When Rob had returned he had expected their friendship to continue where it left off, and it had to a point. But there appeared to be something between them, something that Theon had allowed to alter his views of their friendship, as he acted a bit more indifferent than he used to. With a shake of his head Rob set off to find John, Grey Wind at his side. John had been instructed by his mother to stay away from the royal family, so as not to offend them with his mere presence. That meant John would likely be somewhere the royal family was not to travel. That limited the places where he could be, and if Rob knew his half-brother half as well as he did when they were kids, he knew where to look first. He bent down and scooped up his direwolf, for though he had grown much in the 40 days since they had found the pups, Grey Wind still struggled going up the steps. It wasn't that the direwolf was too small for them, it was more of the fact that the pup was hesitant to go up and down them. The library at Winterfell had a few tables at the front of the room and then rows of shelves that stretched to the back wall. The first thing he noticed was Ghost sprawled out on the floor, his head picking up as Rob and Grey Wind entered the room. John sat at one of the tables, a book spread out in front of him, but he was not reading it. Instead he was in conversation with the imp, Tyrion Lannister, who occupied the chair next to him. Ghost got up and approached Grey Wind, the two wolves sniffing at each other, as Rob walked past them and to the table where John and Tyrion Lannister sat. They both looked up at his approach, and whatever conversation they had been having died down. "Is this where you wasted the morning?" Rob asked. "Is it afternoon already?" John asked, his eyebrows furrowing as he glanced out the windows. "I fear our conversation lasted longer than either of us realized," Tyrion Lannister said. "I must take my leave." Rob and John both bid farewell to the imp, before Rob turned toward his half-brother with a curious look. "I like him," John said, defensively. Rob took the seat next to John, the one previously occupied by the imp. Their direwolves began to play with each other, exchanging little nips as they tumbled over one another. "I didn't say anything." "I saw it in your eyes," John muttered. "He's a better conversation than any of the others who accompanied the king." "What did you talk about?" Rob asked. John's cheeks reddened, either with embarrassment or anger, Rob did not know. Jon remained silent for a moment before he collected himself. He was telling me about growing up as a dwarf in Casterly Rock. Rob's brows furrowed in confusion, wondering why Jon was interested in such tales. Until he realized that growing up the dwarf son of Lord Lannister might not be that different than growing up the bastard son of Lord Stark. Both likely came with people staring and talking about you behind your back, mixed with those who were more bold in voicing their distaste directly to your face. "Were you with father all morning?" Jon asked. "Yes, he said he is to be hand to the king, and will be leaving for King's Landing in a few nights." Jon's eyes widened. "Truly? But Starks don't do well in the south," Robb finished. "He does not appear happy by it, but you know father and his honor and duty. He's trying to teach me about being the Stark in Winterfell. And, he wants to move up my wedding." The concern that originally had been on Jon's face made way for a teasing grin. "Seems your pining for Sweet Winnie will finally be at an end." This time it was Robb whose cheeks reddened. "I'm not pining for her." Jon had grown a bit out of his shell after his fostering, he was also a bit more crass than he used to be. Though things like that could always be chalked up to growing up and being a teenager, there was no doubt both of those changes were the influence of the Umbers. "Oh Sweet Winnie, how I yearn for you!" Jon cried, raising his voice an octave. "I sound nothing like that," Robb said, lunging at his brother. Jon slid out of his chair, away from Robb's grasping hands, and ducked underneath the table. He popped up on the other side with a grin on his face. Robb hated that Jon had always been the faster of the two of them. "We shall be together at last, my sweet, Sweet Winnie," Jon mocked. "You're dead snow." Robb vaulted the table as Jon turned and ran out of the library. Ghost and Grey Wind stopped playing together as Robb chased after his brother and, after a slight pause, the two direwolves bounded after their masters. Chapter 3, Jon I. Jon. Sir Robar Royce, and by extension Bran, arrived shortly after Jon had teased Robb in the library about his upcoming wedding. Jon had been running through the yard, several paces ahead of his brother when the shout of approaching riders went up. His teasing of Robb forgotten, the two of them moved to the east gate that opened up to the King's Road to see who had arrived. It was at that time, before Lady Catelyn or their sisters were told of Bran's arrival and had a chance to greet him, that Robb and he had proudly presented their younger brother with the sixth direwolf pup they had found, the one that seemed to sit there staring in curiosity at its surroundings, but never allowing itself to become attached to someone like the other pups had done with them. Bran and the pup had taken to each other immediately, and much deliberation was given to the potential name of the pup, but none could be decided upon. The appearance of the direwolf pups seemed to be the work of the old gods, Jon thought upon seeing the pup's reaction to Bran. It was hard to find another explanation for not only the discovery of 6 direwolves, 4 males and 2 females, the exact match to the children of Eddard Stark, but that each of the wolves immediately bonded with a child in turn. Sir Robar was less than thrilled that his page now had a direwolf, but he acquiesced when Bran asked if the pup could join them on their travels. The knight saw how behaved the other direwolves were but did warn that if the wolf started acting up he would have to be released back into the wild. The king's retinue stayed in Winterfell for 12 days. In those 12 days, Robb spent the mornings clustered in their father's solar. At the same time, Sir Roderick and Theon led the king and his men on many a hunt throughout the Wolf's Wood, where the large elk, bears, and tree cats provided new and exciting animals for the king to hunt. Sansa and Arya often found themselves sharing their lessons with the princess, much to Sansa's delight and Arya's dismay. Bran, who wasn't old enough to join Sir Robar on the hunts, was either practicing with Prince Tommen in swordplay, or at his mother's side. Jon remembered being delayed one morning, and walking out into the courtyard to see Bran halfway up the broken tower. Before Jon could say anything to his brother, Lady Catelyn had appeared in the courtyard and caught sight of her son. "Bran! Get down from there!" Lady Catelyn shouted. "You've been gone for half a year, and rather than spend time with your mother, you want to climb walls, even though you've been expressly forbidden from doing so." With guilt on his face, with a good mixture of disappointment, Bran had climbed back down and allowed his mother to lead him off somewhere. Jon found himself in the library most of those mornings, Ghost lounging lazily at his feet, and most of the time in the company of one Tyrion Lannister. The man, who was 10 years his senior but a foot and a few inches shorter, had a sharp mind, a sharper tongue, and might be a better storyteller than old Nan herself. Despite their differences, John found himself engaging Lord Tyrion in conversation, John sharing his knowledge of the North, and Tyrion doing the same with the South. The afternoons found John joining Robb and Theon in the training yard with his father and the king. John had been reluctant at first, a bastard had no place training with royalty, but King Robert had insisted he joined them after Sir Roderick had praised his sword fighting in front of the king. There they were often joined by members of the Kingsguard, Prince Joffrey, and the prince's bodyguard, Sandor Clegane, referred to as the Hound by almost all who knew the man. Robb found himself in the unenviable position of having to spar with the prince, who wasn't as good with a sword as either of them, and always had some type of excuse as to why he'd lose. John had sparred with the prince once, but the prince did not take kindly to being beaten so soundly by a bastard, even if John was over 2 years older. The insults had made his blood boil, but a look from father had tempered his rage. King Robert got winded easily, but he still moved with surprising grace given his size. And he wielded the sword he held like a hammer, raining blows upon the shields of any who agreed to spar with him, which was mostly John's father, and 5 of the 6 members of the Kingsguard who made the trip to Winterfell. It seemed that even if the weapon he held was not his famed warhammer, Robert Baratheon did little to change how he fought. Though if one had the strength the king still had, John could understand trying to overwhelm your opponent with your strength. Much to the disappointment of both Robb and John, Sir Jaime did not spar with any during his stay in the north, at least as far as they could see. Which was upsetting because the Kingslayer's swordsmanship was well known, said to rival that of Sir Barristan the Bold and Sir Arthur Dane, and they had hoped to see it for themselves. Even Theon, whose flippant attitude and preference for a bow made him less enthused toward swordplay, had wanted to see the famed Kingslayer for himself. Out of the 5 Kingsguard members who did fight, John found himself not impressed with Sir Boros Blount. The king, the other members of the Kingsguard, his father, and even Sir Roderick could best Sir Boros in a spar. The Kingsguard were supposed to be knights without peer, and while the others were certainly not the warriors of legend their order previously had in their ranks, none were as poor as Sir Boros. On the 13th day, the majority of the king's retinue left in the morning. That included the Queen, all 3 of the royal children, 3 of the 6 Kingsguard members who had made the trip, Sir Mandon Moore, Sir Boros Blount, and Sir Jaime Lannister, all of the household staff that had accompanied the royal family, all of the Lannister men save 5 who remained, and all but 10 of the Baratheon men. Many of the knights who had joined the king's caravan on the journey north had also decided to leave as well, for they were Southron men, and the north was not a place one tended to linger. The king had insisted he would remain in the north and ride back to King's Landing with his hand, which would not be for another fortnight. Sir Aris Oakert, Sir Meryn Trant, and Sir Preston Greenfield were the 3 Kingsguard who stayed behind. The only other people from the expansive retinue that had originally come to Winterfell and still remained, outside of the small amount of Baratheon and Lannister men, and a handful of knights, was the king's squire, Lancel Lannister, and the king's good brother, Tyrion Lannister. "You think I wanted all those bloody people to come with us?" the king had said to their father at dinner the night before the queen left, his booming voice carrying across the room over all other noise. "We would have been here a fortnight earlier if it wasn't for that damned wheelhouse and all the servants." John had a suspicion that the king was happy to be rid of his wife, and to be able to escape being a king for a bit longer here in the north. He hunted in the morning, sparred in the afternoon, and spent his nights getting good and truly drunk while groping the serving maids. No, from what little he observed, John imagined his time in Winterfell was like a vacation to the king. As for Lord Tyrion, John had to admit he had grown fond of the man and would consider him something of a friend. "Why are you staying?" John had asked while they sat in the library on that 13th morning, as the rest of his family was out in the courtyard to see the royal family off. "You have been fortunate enough to not have to spend time with my dear sister," Tyrion answered. "If you had, you would understand why I am choosing to stay rather than spend the next 2 moon's turns in her company. Besides, I wish to see the wall. Well, I wish to piss off it, if I am being honest." John had laughed at that, thinking Lord Tyrion was joking, and the man did have a grin on his face, but it was clear he was serious. "Truly? You want to piss off the wall?" "I do. When your uncle rides back to Castle Black, I shall accompany him." "I do not think you are aware of exactly how cold it is that far north," John responded with a shake of his head. "Or the effects the cold has on your body parts. The large retinue that had accompanied the king to Winterfell was going to be followed by the smaller retinue of Lord Marndale, who would likely be arriving in a senight's time. With the Queen and Princess Myrcella gone, and them no longer needing to play host, Lady Catelyn and Sansa had been frantically rushing about to get everything set up for the wedding. Jon just thought it would involve some words in front of the heart tree in the Godswood, and then a feast afterwards, but apparently more went into it than he realized. In order to be a good brother to Robb, who was more and more nervous as the day of his wedding approached, Jon made it his mission to tease Robb mercilessly about his approaching wedding every chance he got. He was joined in this endeavor by Theon. The one thing that could unite him and the Greyjoy heir was making fun of Robb. After another afternoon of sparring, 9 days after the departure of the Queen and the royal children, Jon found his father grabbing him by the shoulder before he could join Robb and Theon in leaving to bathe off the sweat that coated their bodies. "Jon, I would speak with you before supper." "Of course, Father," Jon said, allowing himself to be steered by his father. They made their way to Father Solar, where they each took a seat. His father looked deep in his thoughts, and it was a moment after they were both seated before he spoke. "I noticed you have been spending your mornings in the company of Tyrion Lannister. Have you heard him say anything about the king or the former Hand, Jon Arryn?" Jon's brows furrowed at the odd question. He shook his head. "No, father, not that I can recall." His father gave a heavy sigh. "I leave for King's Landing in a few days' time. Lord Marndale should be arriving on the morrow, and Robb's wedding will take place shortly after." His father had already told Jon that he was to remain at Winterfell. It was in the same conversation he had denied Jon's request to join the Night's Watch. There had been talk about making sure he stayed out of Lady Catelyn's way, so as not to upset her. Jon knew that Lady Catelyn didn't want him in Winterfell, and his father wouldn't be around to protect him. He'd make sure he not only avoided the lady at all costs but did his best to stay out of her eyesight altogether. "I have heard that when we depart south, Lord Tyrion is to travel to the Wall with Ben. I'd like you to accompany them. Have you changed your mind?" Jon asked, a feeling of eagerness rising within him. Joining the Night's Watch hadn't just been the wish of a teen filled with too much wine. He had spent many a night thinking about it. A bastard could gain honor in the Watch. "No," his father said with a shake of his head. "You are still forbidden to take the black. At least not for a few years. No, I have several reasons for you to make the trip. The first is because that will get you out of Winterfell for the turn of a few moons and away from Lady Catelyn was left unsaid, but both knew it to be the reason. The second is because I would have you see for yourself what it is like to live at Castle Black, amongst the men of the Night's Watch. The third is that I would ask you to keep an eye on Lord Tyrion for me." "Keep an eye on Lord Tyrion?" Jon asked, his face scrunched in confusion. Yes, the man was short of stature, but Lord Tyrion was also a decade older, much smarter than Jon himself was, and would be in the company of several men tasked with guarding him. What could he, a boy of 5 and 10, do to keep an eye on Lord Tyrion? There was a pained look in his father's eyes. "Yes. I know you have grown fond of the man and you share in conversations. All I ask is that in your journeys with him, should he say anything pertaining to the king or of Jon Arryn, anything at all, to make note of it and send me a raven when you get the chance." That did nothing to lessen Jon's confusion. In his conversations with the man so far, Lord Tyrion had complained about his sister and his father, while praising his brother. He spoke sweetly of Myrcella and Tommen, and with disdain when talking about the crowned prince. That was the most conversation they had about anyone in the royal family, and nothing at all pertaining to the previous Hand. Still, his father was making a request of him, and it was a simple one to fulfill. Father, I can do that." His father placed a hand upon his shoulder and gave it a light squeeze. "Thank you, Jon. I know you might have questions that I cannot answer for you. All I ask is that you trust me, and speak of this to no one." Those last few words left Jon with even more questions, but they were questions he held. His father already said he would not answer them, so there was no point in voicing them. "Do you know when they mean to leave?" Jon asked, referring to Uncle Benjen and Lord Tyrion. "The same morning I leave with the king, in a few days' time. After supper tonight, you should begin to pack for your journey to the Wall." 3 days later Jon stood in the Godswood, one of almost 400 assembled. The movement of the wedding from several turns of the moon to a few se'nights had meant a lot of the further away noble families, like the Umbers and Carstarks, couldn't make the trip, but there were still a number of houses in attendance. Glover, Selwyn, Hornwood, and Tall Hart were the larger houses, followed by the smaller houses sworn to them such as Forrester, Marsh, Condon, and Slate. Then there were the Marndalis, who had come with members of the houses sworn to them, Locke, Waterman, Wells, and Woolfield. While the Marndalis were of the Seven, the Starks were of the old gods, and so it was to those gods that the wedding would take place in front of. Although the sun had set and the dark of night gathered around them, lanterns hung from nearby branches, the flames within them flickering upon the wick, bathing most of the godswood in their light. All those gathered in the crowd carried a lit candle in their hands, a warm orange glow cast upon each of their faces. At the base of the heart tree stood Robb, dressed richly in the colors of House Stark, the white cloak hanging off his shoulders embroidered with a running grey direwolf. Next to Robb stood their father, also dressed in the Stark colors, a smile across his solemn face, and King Robert Baratheon, dressed in the yellow and black of House Baratheon. The king was a part of the ceremony because he had insisted that the king being one of those to wed the two would not only be an honor, but also a blessing upon their union. The 400 people stood to two sides. As northern weddings were short affairs, there was no need for seating, leaving a gap between them for Winifred to walk through. Jon stood in the very first row, next to Arya, and on the end of the row opposite Lady Catelyn. Across the gap from Lady Catelyn was Lord Wyman Marndaly, whose girth made the king look small. Off to the side the 6 direwolf pups played with each other, growling and yipping, none the wiser to the importance of the event that was unfolding around them. Jon was pleased to see that while he had been borne the runt of the litter, Ghost was catching up to his siblings in size. Already he was as big as Lady Sansa's direwolf, who was more well-behaved than any of her siblings. Grey Wind was still the largest of them, but Jon secretly hoped that when they all finished growing, Ghost would end up the biggest of them all. A murmur went up from those at the back of the farthering, and walking between the gap in the crowd was Winifred, her dark hair hanging down her back in an intricate braid. She was wearing a cloak of Marndaly colors with the Marndaly merman embroidered on it, and escorted by her fat father, Sir Willis Marndaly. As she walked down the aisle, Jon strained to see his brother's bride between the heads of all those gathered, thankful of his recent growth spurt. Winifred looked beautiful, and Jon felt a flash of envy for his brother. Robb married the beautiful daughter of a powerful house to cement his future as Lord of Winterfell. Jon would be lucky if any girl would marry a bastard. Winifred and her father came to a stop next to Robb, and in front of both his father and the king. "Who is it that comes before the old gods on this day?" his father asked, his voice carrying throughout the godswood. Sir Willis puffed his chest out, reminding Jon of a picture he'd seen of a pufferfish, and looked down upon his daughter with an affectionate smile. "Winifred of House Marndaly, a woman grown and flowered, true-born and noble, comes here to be wed. She comes to beg the blessings of the gods. Who comes to claim her?" "I, Robb of House Stark," Robb said, his voice cracking and drawing chuckles from the crowd and an embarrassed wince from Robb, eldest son of Lord Eddard Stark and Lady Catelyn Stark, heir of Winterfell, do. "And who gives her away before the old gods?" his father asked. "I, Sir Willis of House Marndaly, come before the old gods to give away my daughter, Winifred." "Lady Winifred," the king said, his booming voice echoing off the faraway walls, "do you take this man?" Robb and Winifred shared a look, and even in the dim light of the lanterns, Jon could see the blush that rose on his brother's face. "I take this man," Winifred said. "Lord Robb, do you take this woman?" the king asked. "I take this woman," Robb answered. "Ask the gods for their blessings on this union," the king said, "to ensure a happy and long life together, blessed with many children." Both Robb and Winifred closed their eyes and bowed their heads. Jon counted the seconds in his own head. Almost a full minute before, almost as one, the bride and groom both raised their heads and opened their eyes. As soon as they did, Bran surged forward from his spot next to Lady Catelyn. In his hands he held a cloak of white, similar to the one Robb wore, but smaller in size, a bride's cloak in the colors of House Stark to replace the maiden's cloak in the colors of House Marndaly. It was a task Robb had wanted Jon to do, but Lady Catelyn had argued against it until Robb had relented. Bran held out the cloak for Robb, who took it from his brother. Sir Willis removed the Marndaly cloak from his daughter's shoulders. Rob gave a small nod to Sir Willis before he stepped behind Winifred and placed the new Stark cloak where the Mandaily one had rested seconds before. "With the blessings of the old gods, and those gathered here today, you are now one," his father declared. Those in the crowd cheered, Jon joining them, and he nudged Arya, who had been making faces during the entire ceremony, so she would do the same. Rob and Winifred turned to the crowd, faces red with embarrassment. They both stood there for a moment, as if unsure what to do now. "Well lad, are you going to kiss her or not?" the king asked. Rob looked terrified at the prospect of doing so but gathered what courage he had, turned Winifred to him, and pressed his lips against hers. The crowd cheered even louder, but even then they were almost drowned out by the king's booming laughter. As was customary in the north, Rob scooped up Winifred in his arms and, with a bit of a struggle at first, carried her down the aisle and towards the great hall. "Bet he's glad she doesn't take after her father," Theon muttered from his place behind Jon. "Otherwise he would have thrown his back out trying to lift her." Jon stifled his laughter, sparing a glance back at the grinning face of the Greyjoy heir before they both joined the crowd as they made to follow the newly joined husband and wife. Like every feast since the king arrived, Jon found himself sitting with the squires, though their numbers were much smaller now that most of the Southron knights had left. The feast was grand, if not quite as grand as that first night of the king's arrival. There was roasted boar and elk, each of them prizes on a recent hunt the king had undertaken, the meat slowly cooked for hours so that it fell off the bones at even the lightest of touches. There was cooked fowl with fire-roasted darkened skin and leafy greens covered with nuts and crumbles of cheese. Bowls were spread out, filled with parsnips, sweet corn, peas and carrots, dates shriveled from the sun, and thick rolls smothered in melted butter. Short pitchers filled with different gravies were available to drown everything in the thick, brown sauce, and there was wine, each table sporting several flagons filled with Arbor Gold, Dornish Reds, and spiced honey wines from Lannisport. As he ate his share, Jon did his best to temper his drinking this time around. He didn't want to make a fool of himself like he did the first night of the king's arrival by rushing off with angry tears in his eyes, nor did he want to deal with the awful feeling that had assaulted him the next morning. "The gods punish us for overindulgences," Uncle Benjen had told him between laughter at the sight of Jon slumped at a table the morning after the king's arrival, head held in his hands and a pained expression on his face. "And you indulged more than most last night." Moderation was something his father had taught him growing up, and his uncle used his sorry state that morning to remind him of it. Indulging in things like food and wine and ale was fine, as long as you knew where to draw the line. And if you didn't know where to draw the line you ended up like the king. "I should have been a northerner." Even with the music and the swell of voices that drowned out anyone who wasn't directly next to you, the king's voice carried over the hall. None of that drawn-out shite that the southerners love so much. "Your northern ceremony is nice and short so you can get to the best part of the entire thing, the drinking and the bedding." The music grew in volume, and people rose from their seats to dance across the stone floor that separated the table up on the dais, and the rest that filled the hall. Rob took the hand of his new wife and together they joined the growing throng of couples. Jon could see his father and Lady Catelyn holding each other close, and Theon spinning around a laughing serving girl. Jon was content to sit at the table and observe the festivities, it was what he had done most of his life. Then the music started for the traditional Ceilidh dance and Rob would have none of Jon sitting out the festivities, grabbing Jon's arm and pulling him from his seat. "You can't sit here moping tonight of all nights. You have to dance with someone," Rob said, his eyes hazy from wine. "It's my wedding night." Couples began to twirl around the dance floor, moving in sync with the lively music. "Come off it," Jon said, trying to pull his arm from his brother's grasp. Rob wouldn't allow him to get away so easily, and dragged Jon toward all the dancing couples. "Jane," Rob said, waving Sansa's friend over from where she sat giggling with their sister. "Jon needs a dance partner." Chapter 4, Rob 2. Rob 2. Rob sat in his father's solo with Maester Lewyn and Sir Roderick Castle, and felt completely out of his element. This solo was meant for the Lord of Winterfell and that wasn't Rob, not yet at least. His father's presence loomed large within the room, and would likely do so for all the years his father spent in King's Landing. They had been going over things for over an hour already, and Rob was hoping the session was drawing to a close. He had already appointed a new steward to take over for Veonpool, a new master of horse to take over for Hullen, and a new captain of the guard to take over for Jory Castle. Your father taking half of the guard only leaves us with 100 men, Sir Roderick said. Not enough to defend a castle of this size. Rob knew what Sir Roderick was looking for in response and gave it to him. Canvass Wintertown today, and tomorrow morning ride to the nearby farms and villages to gather new recruits to train. I'm sure the promise of hot meals and stone walls will sound tempting to enough men out there. Winter is coming. Sir Roderick grinned at him, approving of Rob's answer. I will head to Wintertown when we are finished here. Anything else? Rob asked. Lady Arya has been skipping her lessons again, Maester Lewin said, his voice carrying the exasperation of a man who had dealt with his problem before. Rob groaned. Shouldn't that be something my mother handles? The girl is becoming more willful. She heeds your mother for a few se'nights and then goes right back to skipping them. You are her brother, perhaps you might have more sway with her. Rob shook his head. If Maester Lewin was hoping one of her older brothers could get through to Arya, he was talking to the wrong one. Jon and Arya had a bond he would never have with his youngest sister. Rob wondered if it was because they were the only two with the coloring of House Stark. She's much closer with Jon. When he comes back, I will ask him to speak with her about sticking with her lessons. In the meantime, let my mother know. She can keep Arya in lessons until Jon is back. If that is what you wish, Maester Lewin said. It is. Anything else? Neither Sir Roderick or Maester Lewin had any other business to discuss, so Rob dismissed them. He sat rubbing at his temples, content to just enjoy the silence for several minutes. His relief at finally being done with all the day-to-day stuff was short-lived as Jon O's was let in by the guard. Jon O's had worked under Veonpool for a handful of years, and with the steward being away at King's Landing, Rob had selected Jon O's to be the new steward of Winterfell. Maester Lewin must have let the young man know of his new duties and he appeared eager to fill them. Jon O's wanted to go over the stores, to let Rob know where they stood in regards to the winter that would eventually come. His father would still be in King's Landing by then, so it was on Rob to make sure they had more than enough to feed not only Winterfell itself, but to also supply Wintertown, whose population was going to swell by the thousands once the frosts of autumn began to creep over the land. If they were lucky, they'd be able to pull another harvest or two during that time, before the encroaching winter would limit them to a final harvest of carrots and parsnips. The common saying was that a long summer was followed by a long winter, and the summer they were in had so far lasted 10 years. To be on the safe side, they needed stores that would last equally as long but were still far from it because it was hard to keep food, even when properly preserved, for more than a few years. The cellars of Winterfell were not quite full, but Jon O's thought it best to start using up the stores that had been down there the longest, and preserving more of the food they were currently bringing in. Rob had agreed in bringing out some of the longest stored foods and working to preserve more of the new harvests and hunts, but he wanted to make sure people were still eating the fresh food. In a few years, depending on how long autumn lasted, all they'd likely be eating would be pickled this and salted that, so it was best to let the people enjoy the taste of fresh meat and vegetables while they could. As Rob looked over the books with Jon O's, both for the stores and the family treasury, he noticed an amount off to the side, 20,000 silver stags. What is this? Rob asked, pointing at the figure. That is the dowry for Lady Winifred. Your father asked it be set to the side, for you to use at your leisure. Lord Wyman Marndaly and Sir Willis Marndaly had already gifted him a dirk with an ivory handle, a pair of leather gloves lined with fur, a few casks of red wine from Volantis, and a pair of horses, both coursers sired from the horses of Vale Knights. They had been more than generous in their wedding gifts. He had thought the coin for the dowry would be added to the family vault, but looking at the numbers of what the Starks had available to them, he could understand his father allowing him to have it for himself. The Starks did not lack for money, even with all the projects his father had spent the past 15 years on. What did he want to do with the money though? That was the question. A question he didn't have an answer to at the moment. If Theon had the money, he'd likely blow through it in Wintertown, at that brothel he slipped off to every couple of nights. Jon would likely sit on it to use when he reached such an age where he would feel compelled to leave Winterfell to make his own way in life. Rob had neither the vices of Theon, nor the uncertain future of Jon. Is that it? Rob asked 10 minutes later, his vision swimming with numbers. Yes, Lord, that is everything. Rob stood and stretched, feeling something pop in his back at the effort. He had been sitting way too long. John O's gathered the books he had bought, and clutching them to his chest, carried them from the room. Looking out of the window, Rob figured he had enough daylight to get some sword training in, and maybe go for a ride, based on the position of the sun. He didn't have as much time as he thought. After he finished sparring with Wayne, one of the guardsmen who remained at Winterfell, he saw that the sun was already beginning to set and that dinner would likely be ready soon. So instead of going for the ride, he instead went to the baths to wash the stench of sparring off of him. When he exited the baths, feeling fresh with damp hair and a new set of clothes, he almost ran face first into his wife. They blushed at the sight of each other, still in the doe-eyed phase of their relationship, as his mother referred to it. They had only been a husband and wife for a few nights, but those nights had been spent getting to know each other, mostly in a physical sense, and for the first time Rob thought he understood why Theon spent so much time at the brothels. "Are you on your way to dinner, my lady?" Rob asked. "Yes, my lord." Rob held out his arm, and she took hold of it. His mother told him there would come a time in the coming Senites when they would stop greeting each other so formally, where their familiarity with each other would allow them to forego the polite manners they had been instructed to use when dealing with other nobility, but that time was not yet. Together they walked to the great hall, each of them sharing about their day. While Rob had been stuck in his father's solar getting caught up to date on the running of Winterfell now that his father was heading south, Winifred had spent half the day with his mother to see firsthand what it meant to be the Lady of Winterfell, and the other half of the day with her family, who was set to leave for White Harbor on the morrow. They sat together at the high table, Rob in the seat normally reserved for his father and Winifred on his right, and his mother at his left. The Marndalis were still in Winterfell, at least for one more night, so Lord Marndaly and his lady wife sat at the high table with them. As he ate dinner, Rob couldn't help but notice the sullen look on Arya's face as she pushed around the food on her plate. She sat at the lower table in front of theirs, sitting with Rickon, Theon, Sir Willis Marndaly, his wife Leona, Sir Wendell Marndaly, Sir Marlon Marndaly, and Wyler Marndaly. While the Marndalis chatted all around her, with even Rickon and Theon joining in, Arya did not even appear to hear what was being said around her. Rob had a realization then. Bran was off serving Sir Robar Royce as a page. Sansa, along with her friend Jane, had accompanied their father to King's Landing. Jon was accompanying Tyrion Lannister to visit the Wall. Rickon was a child of 4, and Rob was spending most of his time being the Stark in Winterfell. The only person he could think of around Arya's age was Beth Castle, but she was a dreamer more interested in songs of princesses and knights than anything Arya was interested in. That left Arya by herself a lot, and Rob figured it might be one of the reasons she was skipping her lessons. He remembered his time at Carhold, in the company of Haryon, Eddard, and Torren, and thought it might be best to invite the daughters of some of their vassals to be fostered at Winterfell. He knew Mage Mormont had 2 daughters around Arya's age. It was hard to remember, but he believed one of them was a few years older, and the other a few years younger. His wife's younger sister might also be an option. He looked at his good sister, with her dyed green hair that Arya had been fascinated by when the Marndaly retinue had first arrived. "Winifred, how old is your sister?" he asked, speaking in a low voice. "She just turned 14. "Why? Do you think your father would consent to having her fostered here for a few years?" he asked. "Though I should probably ask to make sure it's okay with you too." Winifred's face brightened at the mention of her sister fostering at Winterfell, her lips curving into a smile that made Rob's heart skip a beat. "Of course it's okay with me, why wouldn't it be?" Rob made a face as he remembered all of the fights his 2 sisters had gotten into over the years. "While Jon and I might be the closest of friends, Sansa and Arya don't really get along. They argue more than anything. You have no worries about that with me and Wyler, like Jon is to you, she's my closest friend." That was good to hear, though it did make Rob curious about his wife's childhood. He and Jon were only a few turns of the moon apart, Winifred and Wyler were a few years apart. Dinner passed with Rob hearing more about his wife's childhood, and what it was like growing up in White Harbor, the only city in the north. Rob knew the Marndalis were more southern than the other houses of the north, and hearing his wife describe things that seemed foreign to him drove that point home, the kind of games the children played, the weekly prayers in the September, or daily for those more pious, the gossiping about the latest tourney that had taken place in the Reach, etc. Tourneys weren't of much esteem in the north, but they were of great appeal to those who followed the seven. Faithful lords held them, faithful knights fought in them, and faithful small folk cheered them on. At least, that was Rob's understanding of it. After dinner had concluded, Rob had approached Lord Marndale before the man could rise from his seat. Not that the Lord of White Harbour could do such a thing with much speed given his girth. "Sir Willis, if you could please join us," Rob called down to his good father. As the others left the hall, Sir Willis approached his father and Rob. "What can we do for you, Lord Rob?" Sir Willis asked. "Tomorrow your party is to head back to White Harbour, is that correct?" "Yes, after we break our fast we will make the journey back." Rob felt his heartbeat speed up and he forced himself to take a deep breath. If he couldn't handle making simple requests of his good father and one of his vassals, how could he ever handle being the Stark in Winterfell and Warden of the North? This was nothing compared to conversations he would likely have to have, so allowing himself to get worked up over it was foolish. He took another breath and did his best to steady himself. "Lady Winifred is new to Winterfell, and to help her in adjusting to life here I thought it would be a good idea to have Lady Wyler Foster here for a few years to give my wife a familiar face. I am also hoping Lady Wyler can have a positive effect on my sister Arya. I'm not sure if you have noticed, but my youngest sister is a bit of a wild one. This is all if you would approve, of course. And if Lady Wyler would be okay with it." Sir Willis and Lord Marndale exchanged a look that Rob was unable to interpret. Reading people had always been more of Jon's thing than his own. He wondered if he had said something wrong, or maybe offended the men by asking such a thing. "It warms my heart that you are already thinking of my granddaughter's interest and well-being. When arranging marriages, there is always a fear of the type of man you are betrothing your daughter, or in my case granddaughter, to. And I am happy to see that you are already proving yourself the type of man any grandfather would want taking care of his granddaughter." Rob felt his cheeks becoming warm under the praise. He did his best to keep his gaze level, and not let them drop to his feet in embarrassment. All he did was make a request. Was such praise necessary? "Winifred is my wife and I will do all that I can to make sure she is happy and loved." "Your father did a good job raising you," Sir Willis said with a large smile. "And I think Wyler fostering at Winterfell is a good idea. I will speak with her tonight, and if she is agreeable to it, she will stay here in the morning when we depart. Given that we are likely to have a long winter, I think it would be best if she stays at Winterfell until the late autumn snows start to fall, by which time she can come back to White Harbour for winter." That made sense to Rob. If Wyler was at Winterfell by the time winter fell upon the land, it would be beyond difficult to travel through the winter snows that would cover the ground. His father had told him about a 3-year-long winter, where the snow had fallen taller than a horse. If Wyler didn't leave by the time the deep winter snows started, she would be stuck at Winterfell until winter ended, and who knew how long this next winter was going to be. When Rob arrived for the morning meal with Winifred at his side, he found his mother was the only other person in the great hall. "Good morning, Mother," Rob greeted, sitting down next to his mother. "Good morning, Lady Catelyn." "Good morning, you too." His mother smiled at the both of them as they sat down. She turned her attention to Rob, her smile dropping. "I overheard Lord Marndale saying that his granddaughter Wyler will be staying with us." "Oh yes. I forgot to talk with you about it last night." He noticed her look and realized that while he was the acting Lord of Winterfell, such a decision should have been something discussed with her first. "There are 2 reasons I would like to have Wyler stay with us. The first is for Winifred, so she can have a familiar face during her first few years adjusting to Winterfell." Winifred beamed at him, and he smiled back at her. Winifred was overjoyed at the companionship her sister would provide during her first few years at Winterfell, and had shown her appreciation last night. If that was how Rob was rewarded for doing things that pleased his wife, he vowed to do it as often as possible. "The second is, well, I'm not sure if Maester Lewin spoke with you yet, but Arya has been acting out and skipping lessons again. I figured with Sansa and Bran gone, she might be a bit lonely. I wanted to have girls around her age here to hopefully influence her." "And these were things you could not discuss with me first?" his mother asked, a frown on her face. Rob bowed his head in shame. "I'm sorry, Mother. The idea came to me last night, and I wanted to speak with Lord Marndale before it was too late." The frown on his mother's face softened. No, you don't have to apologize. With your father gone you are the Stark in Winterfell. I'm just not used to my baby boy being all grown up, and being able to make these kinds of decisions without me. I have not yet spoken with Maester Lewin about Arya, but I agree that having some noble ladies around her age might have a positive influence on her. Despite her hair, my sister is a proper lady. Winifred winced as if remembering something painful, if a bit sarcastic. Sarcasm is good, Robb assured her. Arya doesn't like prim and proper. She is the opposite of Sansa in that respect. Who else were you going to invite? Mage Mormont has 2 daughters around Arya's age. I was going to send a raven to her after eating. House Mormont might not be the strongest of houses in the north, but if Lady Mage accepted his offer to foster her daughters here, that would increase her loyalty to House Stark. Robb would expand upon his father's task of increasing the loyalty of the northern houses. Would that be wise? His mother asked. She saw the questioning look on his face. Mage Mormont is from Bear Island. She is a fierce woman who wears ringmail and carries a mace. She leads her men into battle herself. I imagine her daughters will be similar. Not exactly the kind of influence you are looking to have on Arya. Before Robb could respond, Arya herself walked into the Great Hall. Only a few paces behind her was Lord Marndale. You might be right, Robb conceded. Let's wait to discuss this further until after I have a conversation with your sister about skipping lessons. Late that morning, Robb knew when his mother decided to talk with Arya about skipping lessons because he could hear the yelling from his father's solar. Grey Wind sat on his haunches, head tilted as the yelling voice of his sister drifted through the window. That meant Arya was in the Godswood, when she should have been at lessons with Maester Lewin. He couldn't discern everything that was being said, but he could tell by the tone it was a nasty argument. Shortly after the yelling stopped, his mother entered the solar and sat down across from him. That child grows more and more willful every day, she said with a sigh. I'm not sure how much longer I'll be able to get her to stay in lessons, especially with your father gone. Jon might be able to help when he's back. Robb winced as a dark look overcame his mother's face at the mention of his half-brother. I do not know why your father has insulted me as he has by insisting that boy remain here. Robb decided it would be best to ignore the comment. His father had never been able to change his mother's mind on Jon, and Robb doubted he would be able to do so either. Arya is closest to Jon. If she'll listen to anyone, she'll listen to him. We just have to try to keep her in line for the next few nights until he is back from the war. His mother let out a shuddering breath. While the Mormont girls might be rough around the edges, if they are anything like Mage, then they won't shirk lessons like Arya. If Mage is open to it, I will welcome them at Winterfell. Robb grinned, pleased his mother came to agree with his thought process. I will send a raven to Lady Mormont as soon as Maester Lewin is done with the morning lessons. Will you invite any other ladies? His mother asked. What of Aelys Karstark? You fostered with her family for 5 years, it would be a good way to honor Lord Karstark. A look must have come over Robb's face. His mother looked at him with some concern. What is it? I thought things went great with the Karstarks. Your father was very pleased with the updates Lord Karstark sent him. They did, Robb assured. It's just, Aelys had a bit of a crush on me when I was there and, well, she was my, first kiss. He could only describe the sound that came out of his mother as a giggle, though he had never heard such a sound come out of her before. She looked at him in amusement. And you are unsure how Aelys will behave around your wife? Yes, Robb responded, feeling his cheeks aflame in embarrassment. It was a silly thought to have. He and Aelys had kissed a few times, but it had never progressed from there, and he didn't think there would be any issue, but it was better to be on the safe side. Jealousy can make people do strange things, his mother said, gazing at the far wall for a moment before shaking her head. All right, so no to Aelys Karstark then. Doesn't Lord Reed have a daughter around Arya's age? Robb asked, face scrunched in thought. Lord Reed has a daughter named Meera, who is your age. And given the amount of times your father asked Lord Reed to come to Winterfell, and was declined, I doubt he would acquiesce to his daughter coming here. If his father had dealt with the declining of an invitation to come to Winterfell from any of the other northern lords as many times as he had from Lord Reed, there would be anger and suspicion cast upon the lord. Yet when it came to the Cranogman, his father either had a soft spot, a blind spot, or a combination of the two, depending on who you asked. Rob had heard about how Lord Reed had been the only one to come back with his father when he went in search of his sister after the war, and his father had claimed Lord Reed had saved his life. Rob thought Howland Reed his father's closest friend after King Robert. He imagined that gave the Lord of Greywater Watch a lot more leeway than would otherwise be granted. Chapter 5, Ned 2. Ned 2. Leaving Winterfell had pained him in many ways. Since he had ridden back to the seat of his family 15 years ago, he had left the castle many times and had been gone for se'nights, even the turn of a moon if needed, but never had he ridden south of Moat Cailin again. The south had seen the end of his father, his brother, his sister, dozens of honorable men he called friends, and thousands of the northern small folk that had marched at his command. 9 years ago he and a host of 8,000 men had been picked up by a part of the Red Wine fleet off the coast of the Rills, to lay siege to Harlaw, before joining his force with Roberts to storm Pike, but that had been after refusing to ride his host south to the Westerlands to join up with the king's army at Lannisport. The last time he had ridden to the south he had been a teenager rushing off to fight a war to avenge his family, and to rescue his sister. Now he was a man grown, with a wife whom he loved and children of his own, one of whom he had seen wed just the other day, and another two who joined him on this march south. He was going to be separated from most of his family, and his home, for who knew how long. While he didn't march with 30,000 northerners at his back like he had done all those years ago, he had taken half of the house guard, 100 men, including Jory Castle who was captain of the guard. He had also taken some members of his house staff, including Veon Poole the steward of Winterfell, Hullen the master of horse, and a handful of cooks and servants. Sansa rode in a wagon with her friend Jane Poole, Veon's daughter, and Bran rode next to Sir Robar, who would accompany them on the journey to King's Landing in order to participate in the tourney Robert insisted they hold in honor of Ned becoming Hand, regardless of his protest against doing so. The only reason Ned wasn't putting up too much of a fight against the tourney was because it allowed him to spend more time with his second son. While everyone knew of the ache in a mother's heart when separated from her child for so long, less acknowledged was that the same ache was in a father's heart as well. The king, despite being rid of most of the retinue he had traveled north with, was accompanied by 3 of the Kingsguard, 10 Baratheon men, a dozen knights with a few squires in tow, his own squire, Lancel Lannister, and a handful of servants to set his tent and serve his meals. It had seemed a small amount to travel back to King's Landing with, at least when one of your party was a king, but when Ned had expressed his concerns to Robert, the king had merely slapped his back with a laugh. "What do I need another 50 men to guard me for when I have Ned Stark riding besides me?" Robert had said. "We toppled a dynasty together. Do you think some brigands will be the death of us?" Ned felt at ease on their travels throughout the north. This land was known to him and the Starks were held in high regard by highborn and small folk alike. It was past the neck that he had his worries, in the lands he didn't rule and didn't know. Still, even without most of Robert's retinue they were likely too big of a party for any bandits and highwaymen to attempt to attack. Robert was as carefree on the ride south as he had been at Winterfell in the 16 days after his family had left. While their party marched down the road, Robert would spur his horse in some direction or another, sometimes to try to chase down a deer seen grazing nearby, other times to race up a hill so he could have a better look of the land, and then there were times where he did it just because he wanted to race. Each time he would take off he would yell at Ned to follow him, King's orders, and Ned would order the men around him to follow before he'd take off after his friend. At night Robert would gather the knights who traveled with them around the fire and over several skins of wine they would share their stories of war and triumph, or tell bawdy jokes that would make a maiden blush. To Ned it was as if the king was a teen in the Vale again, taking the time to enjoy himself as he left the duty of ruling the realm to his small council while he was away. They were approaching a moon's turn since setting out from Winterfell. Moat Cailin would likely be coming into view shortly, and it would give Ned a chance to see how the improvements to the north's most important defensive position was coming. He was already seeing the benefit of one of his deeds, as their travels had been smooth so far. "How has the road remained in such good condition?" Robert asked him a few days into their ride. "In the south we lost many days riding because of holes in the road breaking the axles of wagons and that damnable wheelhouse. And we don't have the winters you do. I paid to fix the road in the north after the last winter," Ned had answered. That winter was as long ago as Arya was old, and he was glad to see the repairs were holding up. It took over a year, but every hole and every crack within the road from the borders of the Riverlands to the wall itself has been repaired. Robert had been silent for a moment, hand disappearing in his beard to scratch at his chin. The King's Road and its well-being falls to the Crown, and the Crown should be the one to repair it. When we arrive at King's Landing, speak to Littlefinger, I will have you compensated. Outwardly, Ned bowed his head and expressed his gratitude. Inwardly, Ned had no wish to speak with Petyr Baelish, but knew, as the man was master of coin, that he would have no choice but to. Catelyn spoke highly of the small man, and Robert talked about his ability to rub two coins together to produce a third, but Ned remembered the story of the small boy who had challenged his brother Brandon to a duel over Cat's hand. 16 years ago the man was so in love with Catelyn he had been willing to die to prove it. How could Ned expect to trust a man who loved his wife so? There was a high chance that Cat still held a place in the man's heart, even after all these years since they had last seen each other, but that place did not include Ned. And Baelish was only one of his concerns with Robert's small council. Grand Maester Pycelle had been a Targaryen man, serving the Dragon Kings for 25 years before he had become a Lannister man, urging the Mad King to open the gates to the Lannister army, which had turned out to be the Mad King's undoing. There was little doubt the man was still a Lannister man. Varys was another who worked under the Targaryens, but while Pycelle had served under 3 of them before Robert, Varys had been brought over from the Free Cities by the Mad King himself, and had remained loyal to the end. That Robert had pardoned such a man who thrived on deceit and secrets, had made Ned's skin crawl. That he allowed him to remain in his position on the small council was even worse. Ned knew little of the youngest Baratheon brother, Renly. The boy had been born at Storm's End during Ned and Robert's fostering in the Vale, and when the war he waged with Robert across the realm had taken place, Renly was a child of 5 and besieged at his family's ancestral castle. When Ned had relieved the siege Mace Tyrell laid upon Storm's End, he had only stayed for a few days before directing his fellow Northmen home as he set off in search of his sister. Robert had named his youngest brother Master of Laws only recently, but Ned did not know if it was due to Renly being the little brother or because Renly truly deserved the honor. The only one Ned thought he could rely on would be Stannis. The middle Baratheon brother held no love for Ned. He had known that since the Greyjoy rebellion, when he could see the envy Stannis had for Ned's relationship with Robert, even after years of not seeing each other. He doubted the 9 years since then had made any difference. But he knew Stannis to be a man of honor and duty, and that he could work with. Except Stannis had left King's Landing shortly after Jon Arryn's death, and ravens from other members of the small council requesting his return had gone unanswered. When that news had reached Robert, he growled that he'd travel to Dragonstone himself to knock some sense into his brother. "I thought to ride with you, Your Grace." Ned was shaken from his thoughts as Sir Robar rode up next to him and Robert, Bran following closely behind. Ned smiled at his son, enjoying the time he got to spend with his middle son these past few nights. "Sir Robar," Robert said with a welcoming grin. "How do you think you'll fare in the tourney?" "Come Bran," Ned said, waving his son forward as Sir Robar and Robert talked about the different knights they suspected to show up for the tourney, and how each of them would fare. "I've noticed you ride a horse much better now, more sturdy in the saddle." Bran's horse was a pony, small in size even when full grown. It allowed his smaller frame and strength more control over the horse on his rides with Sir Robar. There was no family guard to keep an eye on Bran, to lend assistance should he struggle to control the beast he rode, like there had been when he rode at Winterfell. He had no one to rely on but himself, and until he was stronger, a pony would be his only mount. "Sir Robar makes sure I practice between my duties," Bran said with a look of pride on his face. He said it is just as important for a knight to know how to ride a horse as swing a sword. "Sir Robar speaks true," Ned said. "If there is ever a battle, as a knight you would be one of the cavalry, meant to charge and break infantry lines. Is that what you did when you fought in King Robert's War?" Ned recalled the battles he had fought so long ago. Only twice had he rode a horse into them. The first was the Battle of the Bells, but he had quickly been forced to dismount as they fought through the streets and in the buildings. The second was the Battle of the Trident, where he had stayed on his horse throughout the entire battle, until Robert had slayed the Dragon Prince and the Mad King's army fled the field. There hadn't been much of a fight in King's Landing, nor when he lifted the siege of Storm's End. The fighting on Harlaw and Pike was without horses because they didn't want to deal with transporting the animals to the Iron Islands, where lack of pastures and fields meant little natural food. When needed, though you must remember, I am no knight. I am of the north, and it is rare for those of us who follow the old ways to be knighted. Where is your direwolf? He's back with Sansa and Lady. Have you thought of a name for him yet? His son shook his head with a grimace. The names of the other wolves had come easily to their masters: Grey Wind, Ghost, Lady, Nymeria, and Shattydog. Yet Bran struggled to think of a name befitting the direwolf that had claimed him as much as he had claimed it. You'll think of something, Ned assured his son. Now, tell me what you think of the Vale. Bran's eyes lit up and spoke of all the places he had visited in the Vale in the several moons turns he had been there. His favorite view, though, while he had never personally been to it, was the Eyrie. He had seen it from afar and he had marveled at how high up it was. Ned had made the treacherous trek up and down from the Eyrie many times in his youth. Jon Arryn had told him that capturing the castle would be all but impossible, but Ned knew like all other castles it could be sieged. You just needed to know of the hidden passages in the mountains in order to block supplies from reaching it. Passages Ned knew from sneaking through them with Robert as young teens. Ned, I meant to ask, Robert said, interrupting Bran and Ned's conversation, when did you set about doing that? Robert nodded his head at a small village ahead of them. There was a large wooden keep with a stone foundation, a few more wood and stone buildings, a handful of hovels, and then about a dozen small farms with plowed fields, pens for the few livestock that roamed, and 3 barns. Further up the road, past the town, rose 4 stone towers. It started a couple of years after I arrived back in the north, right after Sansa was born. First the towers, then the keep, then the other buildings. Afraid of an attack or planning to rebel? Robert asked. If the Mad King had asked such a question, Ned would have been scared at what the man thought. Aerys had been a paranoid who saw assassins in every shadow and conspiracies in every conversation he couldn't personally hear. Yet it was not the Mad King who asked, it was his friend, who though many pounds heavier, still gave him that wide grin that had adorned his face most of their teenage years. Rebellion, Ned said with a straight face. It is said the king drank all the wine in the south and was marching north to take every drop of wine the north had. I could not stand idly by while such a thing happened. Robert laughed. Not all the wine, though not for lack of trying, I promise you. Is this Moat Cailin, father? Bran asked. He had often told his kids that Moat Cailin would allow 100 archers to hold off an army of thousands, now it could hold off even more than that. In the old days a cadet branch of the Starks were the lords of the area, but that line had died out hundreds of years ago, right around when the defenses started going to ruin. Ned planned to start the Starks of Moat Cailin anew. His first thought had been Jon, allowing the boy to start his own house, but he would never hear the end of it from Cat, and that was a headache he didn't need. If Bran followed his dream of becoming a member of the Kingsguard, he would never be able to be a lord or have a family. That left Rickon, who was still 15 years away from being old enough to hold such a position. Yes, it is. When I took over as the Lord of Winterfell, repairing Moat Cailin was a task I set for myself. It has been a slow process, and still has a few years left, but it is much improved from what it used to be. A rider approached their column from the south, and Ned could see it was Jory Castle, who he had ordered to ride ahead and speak with the steward of Moat Cailin. Sir Robar looked up at the sky and squinted. Will we be setting camp soon, Your Grace? Robert looked up at the sky as well. It is still a few hours until the sun sets, but we will stop at Moat Cailin. Last thing I want is to be setting up camp in the bogs any more than I have to. The neck isn't so bad, Ned said. It was mostly true, as long as you stuck to the King's Road, that is. While it was uncomfortable sleeping on the stone of the road, when traveling the neck it was rare to find dry and solid land on the sides of the road to set a tent. Oftentimes land you thought looked solid was not, and you wouldn't realize your mistake until you disappeared into the earth. It's not so bad, Jory Castle said as he approached them, until you wake up realizing that warm woman you dreamed you were sharing your blankets with is really a lizard lion. That got a chuckle out of the 3 men, and a confused look out of Bran. I bring word from Steward Leopold Tallheart. He says if your grace wishes, he has food to give and rooms ready in his keep for you to spend the night. Tell Steward Tallheart his grace wishes, Robert said. If I'm going to be waking up next to a lizard lion the next several nights, I'd like one night in a warm bed beforehand. As they moved closer to Moat Cailin, Ned could see the curtain wall starting to take shape. Its foundation was laid, running between the towers. The King's Road was still open, a 50-foot gap between the walls where the gatehouse would eventually be built. There were a few men with bows spotted in the windows of the towers, a handful at most. The village around Moat Cailin would need to grow by several thousand for the stronghold to have a proper garrison not supplied by one of the other lords. Their offer of land to farm had attracted a couple of families, but it wasn't enough. Ned wondered if he could get some of the small folk in the south to make the trek. Maybe after the next winter, so they'd have time to settle in before the snow started to fall. 8 days later they finally reached the end of the Bogs of the Neck. To their left rose the high peaks of the mountains of the Vale, and somewhere to the right, past the hills and farther than any eye could see, would be the Twins. The home to late Lord Frey, as his good father had called Walder Frey after he arrived at the Trident the day after the battle. Walder Frey and his men had been summoned a moon's turn before Ned and Jon Arryn had arrived at Riverrun for their dual wedding to the Tully sisters, and when Ned and Jon had left a fortnight after their wedding, the Freys were still nowhere in sight. "I am the King of 7 Kingdoms," Robert said, as he gazed upon the mountains of the Vale, "and I often forget that the north is the size of all the others combined. More than half our ride is through your lands." "The north is vast," Ned agreed, "but its population is sparse. That's because the weather is as dour as its people. Everyone's too miserable to fuck." Ned shook his head as Robert's booming laughter followed his words. He was grateful neither of his children had been around to hear the king's crude joke. There was a commotion behind him, as the horses in the line began to act skittish. Ned and Robert didn't have a chance to look behind them before it was happening to their horses as well. As he struggled to get the beast under control, Ned saw at his side Lady, who had raced up from her spot farther back in the line, slowing down to match his pace. Only a few turns of the moon old, the direwolf pup was almost the size of a grown hound. "All right, you bloody thing," Robert muttered as his horse continued to give him trouble. "I'll leave you to the wolf, Ned." Robert urged his horse forward, to ride toward the front of their retinue. Glancing behind him, Ned saw that Sansa was riding a horse instead of in a wagon, and was approaching where he rode. "Where is Jane?" Ned asked his daughter as she came to his side. "Still in the wagon. She's little practice on a horse." "Is the wolf behaving?" "Oh yes, father. Lady is a perfect lady," Sansa gushed, looking at the direwolf that walked at their side. "She's much better behaved than the others." He had been nervous about bringing the direwolf to King's Landing, even if she was more well-behaved than her litter mates. Not to mention Bran's direwolf, even if his son and his pet would only be in King's Landing for a few moon's turns. It was a large city filled with over 500,000 people, and was made of stone and wood. It was no place for a wild animal, especially one as large and dangerous as a direwolf. People would panic just at the sight of them, and while they were well behaved now as pups, there was no telling how they would act when they got older. Last thing he needed was for the wolves to kill someone, especially someone from an important family who would rightfully take offense. But Sansa had pleaded with him for hours to let her bring Lady, eyes filled with tears as she sobbed and begged, and Sir Robar had already given Bran the okay to bring his. When he had broached the subject with Robert, the king had readily approved of bringing the direwolf. The king found the thought of the direwolf scaring people at the mere sight of it funny, and he laughed even more when he thought of all the stuffy lords, all high and mighty, wetting themselves as the animal walked amongst them at court. Not that Ned would allow the direwolves out of the Tower of the Hand, except for jaunts in the Kingswood to let them stretch their legs and do some hunting. He had ordered Harwin, the son of Hullen and one of the guards traveling with him, to get himself nice and friendly with both Lady and Bran's unnamed direwolf because he was going to be the one in charge of bringing them in and out of the city. "Make sure she stays that way. King's Landing is a lot larger and a lot more crowded than Winterfell," Ned said, repeating words he had already voiced to her twice before. "If she causes any issues she will either need to be sent home or killed." Sansa's eyes widened and her face lost what little coloring it had at the thought. "You can't." "I will make sure she doesn't cause any problems, father, I promise." Ned nodded his head. "You named her Lady, now you must make sure she acts like one. She'll cause less trouble than Arya would have," Sansa stated matter-of-factly. Ned knew he should scold his daughter for saying something like that about her sister, but he couldn't fight the grin that took over his face. He had hoped his two daughters would grow up to be fast friends like John and Rob were, but while the two boys had some differences, the differences between his daughters was too large for them to overcome. Sansa was a southern lady who liked music, sewing, and hearing stories of gallant knights. Arya was a northern she-wolf who liked fighting, riding her horse, and going places she wasn't allowed. There were few moments of peace when the two of them were near each other, which was another of the reasons he had thought it best to leave Arya in Winterfell. Arya is a she-wolf. Only in the north can a she-wolf thrive. I tell you this because it does not just refer to your sister. There might come a time in the future where, no matter what you do, Lady will need to go back to the north. You must prepare yourself for such a day. Sansa looked at the direwolf who, sensing his daughter's look, tilted her head up to stare at Sansa. They stared into each other's eyes for a moment, as if having a conversation before Sansa looked back at him. There will never be a need. Chapter 6, Jon 2. Jon 2. It was not even autumn yet and there was already a heavy chill in the air. Uncle Benjen, being a ranger for the Night's Watch, was well aware of the colder weather, having dealt with it at Castle Black before setting out to ride to Winterfell. Jon was also prepared for it. Growing up in the north had prepared him for these chilly autumn nights, even if he hadn't seen a proper winter since he was a boy. Those who weren't prepared for it were Lord Tyrion and his small guard of 5 men. They had thought ahead and brought some heavier clothing, the trip to the wall having been a part of the plan from the start, but it was clothing meant for autumn in the Westerlands, over 1,000 miles south. Reading about the cold of the north and experiencing it were two completely different things, and the Westerlanders were finding that out for themselves. And unfortunately for the southerners the north was vast and sparse. There were no villages on the King's Road they could stop at to buy heavier clothing until they exited the Wolf's Wood, and even those they came across might not have anything for sale. Despite the cold weather, the 8 of them had made good time through the Wolf's Wood. Their nights through the thick woods had been alive with the howls of wolves, whether from one pack or many Jon didn't know as they all sounded the same to him. Ghost had pricked up his ears at the nightly howling but never raised his own voice in reply. In the moon's turn since discovering the direwolf, Jon had not once heard him yip or howl or bark or even growl like the rest of the direwolves from the litter. He had seen Ghost bare his teeth in a silent snarl, but never had he heard the pup make a sound. Ghost was apparently born a mute, which was something Jon did not know animals could be born as. The lack of sound those first few days was part of the reason Jon had named him Ghost. On the 16th day since leaving Winterfell, as they had exited the Wolf's Wood, though the northern tip of the vast forest still sat to their right, and came across the wooden holdfast of House Spire, the land and its ruling family both sworn to House Umber, they came across a trio of others making their way to the wall. The trio was led by Yoren, another member of the Night's Watch that Uncle Benjen referred to as one of the Wandering Crows, a small group of Night's Watch men who walked the realm recruiting new members. Yoren had a twisted shoulder and a sinister look about him. His black hair, as dark as the cloak he wore, was greasy, and his beard was matted. And, though Jon couldn't fully confirm it, it looked like the man had a case of lice. The first night they had come across the new trio, after Jon had been told who Yoren was, he had approached his uncle. Wouldn't it make more sense to send someone more? He had trailed off, unsure how to finish his sentence in a tactful manner. Comely, his uncle had said in the following silence. Jon had flushed at the tone in his uncle's voice. The Night's Watch needs all the able-bodied men it can get. Yoren used to be a ranger, until he fell off his horse during a wildling ambush and messed up his shoulder. With his limitations, wandering the lands and bringing back new recruits allows him to still help the Watch. He could at least bathe, Jon had muttered. And how would you expect him to do that? Many do not offer hospitality to wandering crows, especially when they travel with the type of men who often join the Watch, and the last time he was near waters warm enough to bathe in was south of the Neck. That made sense to Jon, especially when he found out the 2 boys that traveled with Yoren, who both looked around his age, were rapists. When his father had first forbidden him from taking the black he had been angry. He felt like his father had denied him the chance of making a name for himself. Even a bastard could become Lord Commander in the Night's Watch after all, but seeing the 2 sullen boys who would have been his sworn brothers, and who were only joining because it was either that or being gelded, had brought the realization that his father had likely been correct. He truly had no idea the reality of joining the Night's Watch, and had only wanted to do so based on some idealistic fantasy he had developed based on stories from Uncle Benjen and old tales from Old Nan. It was another 7 nights, 23 since they set out, that John had decided to stretch his legs and had come across Lord Tyrion laying separate from the group, a bottle of wine at his side and a book in his hands. He was covered in the bearskin cloak his uncle had given to the man shortly after entering the Wolf's Wood. John got a sense that like his father, his uncle was not overly fond of the Lannisters and that his offering of the bearskin cloak was more as a courtesy than any sort of fondness of Tyrion. "Why do you read so much?" John asked. Tyrion looked up and with a sigh, closed his book upon one of his fingers. "Look at me and tell me what you see." John's brows furrowed in confusion. "Is this some kind of trick?" "I see you, Tyrion Lannister." Tyrion sighed again. "You are remarkably polite for a bastard, John. What you see is a dwarf. You are 15 and you are already taller than I will ever be. You see what I ride on, a special saddle to keep me from falling off my horse. And I'm sure you've noticed I never joined in the sparring sessions because my arms are too short to properly wield a sword. Had I been born a peasant they likely would have left me out to die or sold me to some mummers to at least make some coin as they rid me from their lives. Alas, I was born a Lannister of Casterly Rock and things are expected of me. My father served as Hand of the King for 20 years. My brother later killed that very same king, as it turns out, but life is full of these little ironies. My sister married the new king and my repulsive nephew will be king after him. I must do my part for the honor of my house. Wouldn't you agree with that? Yet how? My legs may be too small for my body, but my head is too large. Although I prefer to think it is just large enough for my mind. I have a realistic grasp on my own strengths and weaknesses. My mind is my weapon. My brother has his sword, King Robert has his warhammer and I have my mind. And a mind needs books as a sword needs a whetstone, if it is to keep up its edge. Tyrion tapped the leather cover of the book. That's why I read so much, John. John absorbed that all in the silence. They had had similar conversations during their mornings together in the Winterfell library, about the difficulty they each faced being what they were. John should have realized that Tyrion's constant reading was a way to prove his worth to his family. Just as John tried to prove his worth to his father by throwing himself into everything he did, whether that be lessons with Maester Lewin, sparring with Sir Roderick, or riding with Hullen. "What are you reading about?" he asked. "Dragons," Tyrion replied. John snorted. "What good is that? There are no more dragons." "So they say. Sad, isn't it? When I was your age I used to dream of having a dragon of my own." "You did?" John didn't know if Tyrion was having him on at that. On the one hand, having a pet dragon that obeyed his commands would give Tyrion respect and power his short stature denied him. On the other hand, the dwarf had a dry sense of humor and was often sarcastic. Oh yes, even a stunted, twisted, ugly little boy can look down over the world when he is seated on a dragon's back. Tyrion pushed the bearskin aside and climbed to his feet. "I used to start fires in the boughs of Casterly Rock and stare at the flames for hours pretending they were dragon fire. Sometimes I'd imagine my father burning. At other times my sister." John stared at him in equal parts horror and fascination. Tyrion guffawed. "Don't look at me that way. You are to tell me you've never had such dreams growing up." "No," John answered immediately, horrified. "I would never." Tyrion raised an eyebrow and deep down, in the parts of his mind he didn't like to acknowledge, John knew the man was right. In times of anger, like when Lady Catelyn was particularly nasty to him, or that time when he and Robb were playing like they always did as children, and he had called being Lord of Winterfell first and Robb said, "You can't be Lord of Winterfell, you're bastard born. My lady mother says you can't ever be the Lord of Winterfell." In moments like that, when he had been angry and hurt due to his family, even as something as tame as stating the truth like Robb had, he would wonder what it would be like if they had all died, and the only one left was he, and then John would be Lord of Winterfell, just like he dreamed as a boy, and there would be none around to stop him. Tyrion didn't push the issue, for which John was grateful. He felt something brush against his hand and looked down to see Ghost there, nudging his head against John's hand. He reached down and petted the direwolf who seemed to have finished his hunting for the evening. Already the pup's head was at John's waist, and at the rate he was growing, Ghost would likely stand at John's shoulder within the year. "Do you know how much farther until we reach Castle Black?" Tyrion asked, changing the subject. "We'll be crossing into Brandon's Gift sometime tomorrow. Uncle Benjen said it should be maybe 4 or 5 days' ride to Mole's Town, and then maybe a few hours' ride from there." Tyrion looked around them with raised eyebrows. "Are we in the new Gift already?" "Yes. In the morning, if you look to the west, you should be able to see the top of Queenscrown." "The history here is fascinating," Tyrion murmured. "To think good Queen Alysanne came along this path with her dragon, visiting these villages and leaving such a remark that some of them named their keep after her. Well, the keep and its surrounding village have both been abandoned for decades. Not even a queen's visit could keep the people here too long. John, there you are." They both turned to see Uncle Benjen approaching them. "I thought you had wandered off." "Sorry uncle, just talking with Lord Tyrion." "What are you doing so far away from camp?" Uncle Benjen asked, with a hard look at Tyrion. Tyrion held up the book he held in his hand, his finger still between the pages holding his spot. "I had hoped to get some reading done without being disturbed. Though that does not appear to be in the cards for me tonight." John felt the heat rise in his cheeks. "My apologies, Lord Tyrion, I didn't mean to disturb you." Tyrion waved his free hand about. "Nonsense, John. I will have no shortage of days to finish the book. I assume dinner is ready." The last part was directed at Uncle Benjen, who merely nodded his head. Tyrion grabbed the bearskin cloak from the ground. "Then I shall grab myself a bite." They both watched the man waddle off. "You should be careful around him," Uncle Benjen said in a low voice. "Especially when you ride back to Winterfell." "What is it about Lord Tyrion that people don't trust?" John asked. He looked around before leaning forward. "Father asked me to keep an eye on him, and report back if he says anything about the king, or the former hand." Uncle Benjen frowned. "While I don't know why Ned asked such a thing of you, I can tell you that it isn't exactly Tyrion himself that leads to the mistrust. It's his family." John's face must have shown his confusion. "You know what happened to the Rains and the Tarbecks, correct? Of how Sir Jaime got his nickname the Kingslayer? And of how Lord Tywine presented the mutilated bodies of Elia Martell, Princess Rhaenys, and Prince Aegon? Everyone knew what happened to the Rains and Tarbecks. Tywine Lannister had a creepy song written about it to make sure everyone knew the story, and the story of the Kingslayer was also a well-known tale. What happened to Elia Martell and her children John had heard only once, from his father after a night of heavy drinking. It had been during his fostering at Last Hearth, when his father had decided to stop by for a visit before he would ride on to see Robb at Carhold. It was all but impossible to say no to the great Jon when the man wanted to drink, and a lot of wine and ale had been consumed before conversation turned to the war. John had heard stories and tales about his father he had never heard before. But the one thing that he would always remember from that night, was the look in his father's eyes when he told of staring at the bloody cloaks that covered Elia Martell and her children, only for the cloaks to be pulled back and brutal deaths each of the three had suffered was laid bare for all those in the throne room to see. It was the look of a man who would forever have the images haunt his dreams. "I know the stories," John confirmed. "Tywine Lannister is a brutal man who will do whatever it takes to avenge even the smallest of slights. His son killed the king he swore an oath to protect, and even all the way up here we've heard stories of how the queen treats people. I do not know the imp, but I know the family he comes from, and it is not a family of honor." "I will keep that in mind," John promised. "Good," his uncle said, grabbing him by the shoulder and steering him toward where the others sat around the fire. "Now come and get something to eat before the others devour it all." They saw the wall when they still had more than a day's ride ahead of them. Even after spending 5 years at Last Heath, which was a fortnight's ride from the wall, John had never seen it before. The closer to it they rode, the higher in the sky it stretched above them until it became the only thing they could see when looking to the north, obscuring the mountains that lay beyond it. The first time he stood at the base of the wall and looked up, John had felt like the most insignificant thing in the world. His uncle said the top of the wall was wide enough for a dozen armored knights to ride abreast. The gaunt outlines of huge catapults and monstrous wooden cranes stood sentry up there, like the skeletons of great birds, and among them walked men in black as small as ants. Castle Black was a bit disappointing to see up close, as it wasn't really a castle. It had no protections to the east, south, or west, so the Night's Watch could never rise up in rebellion against the Seven Kingdoms as they had done once before, his uncle explained. Besides, the only thing the Night's Watch needs to defend against is to the north, and the wall is more than enough protection for that. What Castle Black was 6 stone towers and 6 large wooden buildings. There were tunnels that ran beneath the ground, connecting each of the buildings. A great way of getting around when the ground outside was covered in 10 feet of snow, but despite the chill in the air, it was still summer and there would be months, perhaps even years, before the first snow started to fall. "We don't normally entertain visitors," the Lord Commander said upon their arrival, "no matter who their fathers are." Although it was said to the both of them, Jon had a feeling it was directed more towards Tyrion than himself. Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, on top of being a sworn vassal to House Stark for decades before joining the Watch, had been one of his father's chief advisors during Robert's rebellion. Not to mention that House Stark had always done its best to support the Night's Watch, sending men, food, and other supplies whenever they could, a tradition his father upkept. And that was all on top of Jon being the nephew to the First Ranger. "We promise not to overstay our welcome, and will pay for both food and board during our stay," Tyrion had answered, withdrawing a pouch from somewhere on his person. The small man withdrew 2 gold coins from the pouch and held them out. "This should cover the 7 of us for the first 2 nights." Jon's eyebrows raised at Tyrion paying for him as well. House Stark was not a house that had need of money, and Jon had been given some coin for the journey both to and from Castle Black. The old bear, as the Lord Commander was called by his men, took the 2 gold coins with a sour look on his face. Jon wondered if it was because he thought the coins were seen as some type of charity to the once mighty Order, or because it was a Lannister offering it. It wasn't just his father and his uncle that disliked Lannisters, as most in the north seemed to view the Lions with distaste. Jon awoke the first morning and saw whom he assumed were new recruits practicing in the yard, including the 2 rapists who had arrived with him the night before. They were led by a slim man of 50 years with sharp features. He had black eyes and his black hair was streaked with grey. When he spoke his voice was sharp and cold. The recruits were terrible and it looked as if none of them had ever held a sword before. Most of the recruits looked older than Jon, and a majority of them were taller and likely stronger as well, but he didn't doubt he could take them all on in a sword fight at the same time, and come out the winner. There was one recruit, a fat lad who was already covered in sweat and appeared to be near tears. Jon knew that Lord Wyman Marndale only had 2 grandkids, and if Robb didn't marry one and the other wasn't an attendant of the wedding, Jon would have sworn this boy was Lord Marndale's grandchild solely based off of him sharing the Lord of White Harbour's girth. If Jon had to guess, based on the finery of his clothes compared to the others, the fat lad was the son of a lord, which should have meant some type of sword training growing up, but it was like he wasn't even trying to hold his sword correctly, and it didn't help that the man who did the training was more interested in cursing out the lad, rather than helping him out. Jon winced as the recruit the fat one was training with, slammed his training sword against the fat one's arm causing him to cry out in pain. "For fuck's sake, Tarly, the only thing you're going to do here is eat the Watch out of all its food," the trainer shouted. Jon recognized the name Tarly from his lessons with Maester Lewin. House Tarly was one of the principal houses sworn to House Tyrell in the Reach. Lord Randyll Tarly had a reputation as a great commander of men, and had been praised by his father as such. He wondered what this Tarlis relation was to Randyll Tarly. Surely he had to have been a distant cousin of some kind. The tears Tarly had been holding back until now leaked down his cheeks, and he raised his hands to wipe at them, only to slam the sword and shield he held in his hands together with a clang. That brought snickers from those who had been looking. Jon shook his head and wondered if he should try to help, but he decided against it. He was a visitor here, he shouldn't get involved in Night's Watch issues. "You need something, bastard." Bastard didn't always mean someone like Jon. A lot of times people, often the small folk, used it as a derogatory term for a person they found despicable. Yet the trainer was staring at him as he said it, a sneer on his face. The man had a problem with him, and Jon didn't know why. He had never met the man before now, so he knew it was nothing he had done. That meant it could only be because of something a member of his family had done, as folks were keen to carry over grudges from kin to kin. The likely answer was his Uncle Benjen. Maybe this man was jealous that Uncle Benjen was first ranger over him. From you? John asked. Not at all. He turned and headed to the common hall to grab some food. In doing so he missed the murderous look the trainer gave him. The common hall was full with members of the Night's Watch, each of them dressed in black. A few of them wore well-oiled leather boots and thick cloaks lined with fur. Those men came from nobility and had either committed grievous crimes, for nobles had longer leashes when it came to breaking the law than the small folk, and had taken the black rather than the alternative punishment, or they were so far down the pecking order of their family, with no hope of land or wealth, that joining the Night's Watch was encouraged of them. His uncle Benjen sat at the high table with the Lord Commander, and upon seeing John enter the hall, waved him over. "Who is it that trains the recruits?" John asked, after exchanging greetings with the two men. "Sir Alisa Thorne," Lord Commander Mormont answered. "A hard, bitter man, but a good fighter. The man hates me for whatever reason." Uncle Benjen gave a small grin. "Not to worry, he doesn't like me either. He fought for the Targaryens during the war, and tried to defend King's Landing when the Lannisters sacked it. When the war was over, Tywin Lannister gave all the surviving knights who fought for the Mad King the option of taking the black, or losing their heads. Any relation to any of the rebel families and the man will hate you. He'll hate the imp just as much, if not more, when he sees him." "And what reason did you draw his attention?" Lord Commander Mormont asked. "I was watching the recruits train. They're awful. Yes, unfortunately these days we mostly get thieves and beggars, and murderers and rapists. They don't have any of the training someone of noble birth has. Your uncle said you expressed interest in joining the watch. We could use someone of your training, lad." John frowned. "My father has forbidden it, at least for now. He wants me to wait a few years, to grow not only in body but in mind, before making the decision." Lord Commander Mormont grunted. "I can't say I blame him. I waited until my son was old enough and had made a name for himself before deciding to join the watch, and to let my son be the Lord of Bear Island. Load of good that did me." A sour look came over the Lord Commander's face. John shot his uncle a questioning look, but Uncle Benjen only shook his head. Whatever had transpired with Jeor Mormont's son was a bitter tale that John would not be finding out anytime soon. Chapter 7, Ned 3. While Ned, Robb, and John are the three main, third-person, POV characters, others will make appearances here and there: Arya, Bran, Tyrion, etc. Ned 3. They were still 10 days' ride from King's Landing, approaching an inn just off the road that they would likely rest at for the night, when they were approached by a group of riders. If outriders hadn't made them aware of the advancing horsemen, Ned and his guard would have drawn their weapons in anticipation of a fight. The approaching riders were mostly composed of men in golden-colored armor, except for the two men who led them, one in white and the other in yellow and black. He knew the gold-armored men to be members of the Gold Cloaks, the city watch of King's Landing. It was rare to see them outside of the city. As for the two non-gold riders, Ned recognized Sir Barristan, even despite the years that had passed since he had last seen the knight on Pike. His hair, which still had streaks of blonde during the Greyjoy Rebellion, was now completely white. Yet the man still looked strong and graceful, like he had not lost a step from the legendary knight he was in his youth. Ned knew that when Bran saw Sir Barristan the Bold, his son would likely be starstruck. Bran's favorite knight growing up was Sir Barristan, and now he would have a chance to meet his idol. He would have to warn the man to ignore his son's blatant staring. The man in yellow and black was at first a foreign presence, but the man looked so much like Robert did when the two of them were leading a war against the tyranny of the Targaryens, if a few inches shorter and not quite as muscular. That plus the Baratheon colors, and it could only be Robert's youngest brother, Renly, who Ned hadn't seen since the man was a child of 5 or 6, after Ned had relieved the siege on Storm's End. "You grace Sir Barristan," the Bold said, climbing down from his horse to kneel in front of Robert. "Brother Renly," Baratheon said, bowing his head but not bothering to dismount. "Up, Sir Barristan," Robert ordered. "How many times must I tell you, you do not need to kneel before me so? I'm not a Targaryen, I don't need my ego constantly stroked." Sir Barristan climbed to his feet and was back in the saddle of his horse in the blink of an eye. Yes, time had yet to catch up to Sir Barristan. "When the Raven arrived that you were at Daeari, we decided to ride out and meet you," Sir Barristan said. Queen Cersei and the royal family arrived in King's Landing as we were leaving. Did you not want to travel in the wheelhouse, brother? Renly asked with a smirk. May the seven see that damn thing burned to the ground, Robert muttered. Ned greeted Sir Barristan and Renly, and they him, before the two men and their escort of gold cloaks turned about, and joined the king's retinue. King's Landing is the same as always, Renly said. Nothing's changed since your departure, it still smells like shit unfortunately. The important things that were going on in the realm were known to Robert, who received messages during their travel, brought by a rider from King's Landing sometimes se'nights after the message was written. A few se'nights ago, while they were still in the neck, the king had received a message from Varys informing of Daenerys Targaryen's marriage to a great Khal of the Dothraki. Ned and Robert had an argument over that, as Robert wanted to send an assassin to kill the Targaryen girl, who was only 15 years old, and Ned thought to leave her be unless it became known she was making plans to return to Westeros to try to avenge her fallen family. From what he knew of the Dothraki, they hated salt water and he thought it was doubtful they would cross the narrow sea. But if you kill the Khal's bride, he had argued, maybe you enrage him enough to attempt the crossing. Robert had held off on the assassination for the moment, but Ned knew if more information came of the upswing of the Targaryen exiles, he would not be able to stay Robert's hand. The smaller things, like the day-to-day running of King's Landing, were not known, and despite being away from the city for almost 6 turns of the moon, it appeared Robert had no care to hear them, let alone discuss them. So Ned, in his new duties as Hand of the King, was the one who found himself discussing what was happening in the city. Most issues in King's Landing seemed to come down to one fact: the city was vastly overpopulated. Its outer walls, which had been set by Aegon the Conqueror 10 years after his conquest of Westeros 288 years ago, limited the expansion of the city itself, and the population had finally reached the breaking point. Eventually people would start setting up makeshift shelters outside the walls, but even if it was times of peace, no military commander could allow anything outside the walls like that. They would either need to build new outer walls several hundred feet from the current ones, something that would take years, or they would need to do something to reduce the population. Those would be decisions that would fall upon Ned to oversee in his new position as Hand. He knew from the history books that overpopulation tended to lead to plague, and plagues did not discriminate when they ravished a population center. Last thing he wanted to see was thousands dead or dying, and he unable to do anything to stop it, especially if that dead and dying included his children and household. 10 days later they finally arrived at King's Landing, and Ned laid eyes upon it for the first time in 15 years. Riding next to him was Sansa, who stared at the city with wide eyes. It's so big. Welcome to King's Landing, Ned said, trying his best to keep the disdain from showing on his face. On the other side of him was the king, who did nothing to hide the disdain he felt. They were still far enough away where the stench of the city had yet to reach them, but it was only a matter of time until their nostrils would fall under assault from it. Instead of heading toward the gate directly in front of them, the old gate, the leaders of their procession turned their horses to the right and led them south. They traveled parallel to the walls until they came upon the Gate of the Gods. If Ned remembered the layout of the city correctly, a street led straight from the Gate of the Gods to the base of the winding path that led to the Red Keep. These gates were thrown open at their approach, and a long line of gold cloaks were assembled to escort them through the city and to the Red Keep. A lot of the citizens stopped what they were doing to watch their retinue march through the streets. Curious looks were given to the Stark banners, which hadn't been seen in the city since it was sacked. Those looks turned to terror at the sight of Lady and Bran's still unnamed direwolf, as they padded alongside their owners. Talk would spread of the direwolves of House Stark. "Get you and yours settled," Ned Robert said, as they arrived at the Red Keep, "and then I expect you and your children in the Great Hall for dinner." Ned was sore, tired, hungry, and irritable, and not in that order. He had been riding for almost 3 turns of the moon and wanted nothing more than a hot soak, a quick bite to eat, and then to lay down in a nice feather bed to drift off to sleep. The last thing he wanted was to go have dinner with the king. "As you command." "I will see you at dinner," Ned replied with a bow of his head. They were led to the Tower of the Hand by one of the gold cloaks. Ned got Sansa set up in a room below his rooms, and gave one of the guest rooms on the ground floor to Sir Robar and another to Bran, so that his son would be nearby during Sir Robar's stay in the city. With that settled, he asked Veon and Jory to get sorted what they could, but assured both men that most things could wait until the morrow if needed. Ned had only a few seconds of peace in his new rooms within the tower when one of Robert's stewards knocked on his door with the news that Grand Maester Pycelle had called an urgent small council meeting. Ned wanted to tell the steward, and Grand Maester Pycelle, where they could shove the meeting, but decided against such an approach. My wagons are still straggling through the city. I shall need appropriate garments. It will be my pleasure, the steward said with a bow. And so Ned walked straight into the council chambers, bone-tired and dressed in borrowed clothing, to find 4 members of the small council waiting for him. The chamber was richly furnished. Mirish carpets covered the floor instead of rushes, and in one corner 100 fabulous beasts cavorted into bright paints on a carved screen from the summer isles. The walls were hung with the tapestries from Norphos and Qohor and Lys, and the pair of Valyrian sphinxes flanked the door, eyes of polished garnet smouldering in black marble faces. The councillor Ned liked the least, the eunuch Varys, accosted him the moment he entered. Lord Stark, I was happy to hear of the marriage of your son and heir to Lord Marndalis' granddaughter. I have prayed for their health and prosperity. His hand left powdered stains on Ned's sleeve and he smelled as foul and sweet as flowers on a grave. I thank you for your well wishes, Ned replied. He disentangled himself from the eunuch's grip and crossed the room to where Lord Renly stood by the screen, talking quietly with a short man who could only be Littlefinger. Whenever he saw Renly, it was as if the years had slipped away and Robert stood before him fresh from his victory on the Trident. I see you have found the small council chambers without issue, Renly said at Ned's approach. I have, thank you. You must forgive me, but sometimes you look to me the very image of your brother Robert. A poor copy, Renly said with a shrug. Though much better dressed, Littlefinger quipped with a sly grin. Lord Renly spends more money on clothes than half the ladies at court. It was true enough. Lord Renly was in a dark green velvet, with a dozen golden stags embroidered on his doublet. A cloth of gold half-cap was draped casually across one shoulder fastened with an emerald brooch. There are worse crimes, Renly said with a laugh. The way you dress for one. Littlefinger ignored the jib. He eyed Ned with a smile on his lips that bordered on insolence. I have hoped to meet you for some years, Lord Stark. No doubt Lady Catelyn has mentioned me to you. She has, Ned replied with a chill in his voice. The slight arrogance of the comment wrinkled him. I understand you knew my brother Brandon as well. Renly Baratheon laughed. Varys shuffled over to listen. Rather too well, Littlefinger said. I still carry a token of his esteem. Did Brandon speak of me too? Often, and with some heat, Ned said, hoping that would end it. He had no patience with this game they played down here in the south, this dueling with words. I should have thought that he'd ill suit you Starks. Here in the south they say you are all made of ice and melt when you ride below the neck. I have no plans of melting anytime soon, Ned said, as he moved past Littlefinger and to the table where the Grand Maester sat with his eyes closed. Was the man asleep? Maester Pycelle, I hope you are well. Wispy strands of white hair fringed the broad bald dome of Pycelle's forehead. The chain he wore was long and heavy-looking, with links made of almost every metal known to man. Tired-looking eyes opened and blinked in surprise as they looked at Ned. Our Lord Stark, I am glad you are here. Perhaps we might begin soon. I fear I shall fall asleep if we wait much longer. As you will. The king's seat sat empty at the head of the table. Ned took the chair beside it, as the right hand of his king. My lords, he said formally, I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. You are the king's hand, Varys said. We serve at your pleasure, Lord Stark. As the others took their custom seats, it struck Ned forcefully that he did not belong here in this room, with these men. He remembered what Robert had told him in the crypts below Winterfell. I am surrounded by flatterers and fools, the king had insisted. Ned looked down the council table and wondered which were the flatterers and which the fools. We are but 5, he pointed out. Lord Stannis took himself to Dragonstone shortly before the king went north, Varys said. And our gallant Sir Barristan no doubt stands guard of the king. Perhaps we best wait for Sir Barristan and the king to join us. Renly laughed. If we wait for my brother to join us, we'll be sitting here for years. No, he lets the small council do most of the ruling. Though he will issue us commands. Like this morning, he asked me to ride ahead of the column with all haste to have Maester Pycelle call this meeting, for he has an urgent task for us. Renly withdrew a tightly rolled scrap of paper that had the king's royal seal stamped upon it. The scrap of paper was passed up to Ned, who broke the seal and read the letter with a steely gaze. "Our king wants us to hold a tourney in celebration of our new hand," Renly declared. Ned had known of Robert's desire to throw a tourney in celebration of his appointment, but to make it a matter so urgent that it could not wait a day for Ned to at least get settled. What was his friend thinking? "How much?" Littlefinger asked, mildly. Ned read the answer of the letter. 40,000 golden dragons to the champion of the joust, 20,000 to the man who comes second, another 20,000 to the winner of the melee, and 10,000 to the victor of the archery competition. That was more gold than the tourney at Harrenhal, often held as the grandest tourney in the realm in over a century. 90,000 gold pieces, Littlefinger sighed. And we must not neglect the other costs. Robert will want a prodigious feast. That means cooks, carpenters, serving girls, singers, jugglers, fools. Fools we have in plenty, Lord Renly said, his customary smirk making its way across his face. Grand Maester Pycelle looked to Littlefinger and asked, "Will the treasury bear the expense?" "You know as well as I do that the treasury is empty," Littlefinger said. "We will have to borrow the money, likely from the Lannisters. We already owe them 3 million gold, what's another 100,000? Ned felt his jaw open in surprise. "You mean to tell me the realm is 3 million in debt?" "That's just to the Lannisters. We owe another 3 million gold between the Iron Bank, the Tyrells, a couple of Mirish trading cartels, and the Faith. This couldn't be. Jon Arryn would never have let something like this happen. Aerys left a treasury flowing with gold. How could you let this happen?" "The master of coin finds the money, the king and the hand spend it," Littlefinger said with a shrug. Ned had planned on talking with Littlefinger about recouping the cost of fixing the King's Road in the north, but now thought better of it. He could not in good conscience ask to be made whole for such an expense when the realm was so far in debt. House Stark would shoulder the cost as he originally planned, for they had the means to do so while the crown did not. "This tourney cannot continue," Ned said. "Good luck convincing my brother of that," Renly said. "Still, we should continue as if it will," Littlefinger said. "No," Ned said, louder than intended. The others gave him looks and Ned had to remember he was not in the north, where everyone there was a northerner loyal to his house. "I apologize, my lords, I have been riding for weeks. I am sore and tired, and I am supposed to be having dinner with the king tonight. Let us adjourn for now. I will speak with the king tonight at dinner about this tourney, and we can convene again at a later date." Dinner was a grand affair that had Sansa's eyes wide with awe as she eagerly drank in her surroundings. There was food that had never been served at Winterfell, and gaudy decorations, bright with color compared to the more muted tones of the north. He noticed her eyes sliding over to where Prince Joffrey sat, each time making him wince internally. The Crown Prince was comely, but there was something about the boy that uneased Ned. He wasn't sure what it was, but he was thankful for his good father making a match between Sansa and Brynden Blackwood, sparing him from having his beautiful daughter betrothed to the crowned prince. His other child at court, Bran, was more in awe of the men in white cloaks that stood around the perimeter of the room. He looked at them all in some form of worship, like he had done when they were at Winterfell, but most of his attention was to Ser Barristan, who stood behind the king. Ned had made Ser Barristan aware of his son's idolization of the knight, mostly so the man would know why Bran stared at him so much. These men are pale imitations of what the Kingsguard once was, Ned thought at the sight of the Kingsguard members. Some of Robert's Kingsguard had skill, some had honor, but only two of them had both, Ser Barristan Selmy and Ser Aris Oakurt. Ned recalled the Kingsguard as it was under the Mad King, how such brave, skilled, and honorable men served someone so depraved, Sir Arthur Dayne, Sir Gerald Hightower, Prince Lewin Martell, Sir Oswell Went, and Sir Jonnet Hordari had all died during the war to overthrow the Mad King, some of them needlessly. And in replacing those men Robert had appointed men who paled in comparison, making the Kingsguard a poor imitation of what it should be. After dinner ended and he had some of his guards escort his children back to the Tower of the Hand, and before the king got truly drunk, Ned had called Robert's attention. "What can be so urgent that it cannot wait until the morrow?" Robert demanded as the hall cleared out of the others. "The tourney you said was urgent enough to need a small council meeting the moment I arrived in the city," Ned answered bluntly. "The realm is millions in debt, we cannot afford this tourney." "Bah! Baelish will find the coin, he always does, Robert answered. He finds the coin by borrowing from Tywin Lannister. Do you know the crown owes him 3 million gold dragons? Lord Tywin is my good father, he doesn't care about such a thing. Robert, you've beggared the realm. Ned cried. It's not just to the Lannisters. There's another 3 million owed to various others like the Iron Bank, and they are ones to care for such things. You know I've never been good at counting coppers, Robert responded, defensively. There's counting coppers and then there's what you've done. We can't hold this tourney. I am the king, and I have declared the tourney of the hand to all the realm. It will be held. Robert crossed his arms across his chest and got the look on his face Ned recognized from their youth, the one that said he wasn't going to change his mind. Even under the added fat and the big wiry beard, Ned knew that look well. Then at least change it. There's no need for an archery tournament. And let's at least lower the prizes. Even the tourney at Harrenhal didn't award such. 20,000 for winning the joust, 10,000 for coming in second, and 10,000 for winning the melee. Robert grumbled about it, but he eventually relented and accepted Ned's changes. There was going to need to be even more changes if Ned was going to get the realm out of debt. Given the sheer amount, it would likely take decades for such a thing to happen, and if it ever did it would be under a different king and a different hand, but he at least needed to start the process. There was more out of the king that Ned needed. I also need you to attend the next small council meeting. Robert coughed on the wine he was drinking, some of it spilling from the corners of his mouth and onto his beard. By the 7, I hate those things. To fight this debt I'm going to be making changes that are going to upset some people, some powerful people. To avoid any issues, I need you to give your approval. I made you my hand, you already have my approval to do as you please. I need them to see you give the approval. What does it matter? Robert asked, voice low as he raised his cup to his mouth again. It matters because you are their king. My word can be overruled by you, but none can overrule you. Promise me you'll attend. Promise me, a girl's voice whispered in his mind. Promise me, Ned. All right, all right. I'll attend. You nag worse than a woman, I swear. Ned wanted to pause spending by the crown on everything except food and servant pay until he could go over the books with the help of Veon. He imagined that might upset those who used the royal treasury to buy things, like he suspected Renly did for his clothing. They would need to discuss increasing taxes, likely on trade, which was sure to upset many people across both Westeros and Essos. There would also need to be discussion of a payment plan to those the realm owed money to, but that would have to wait until they could figure out where the money would come from. You couldn't give away money if you had none to give after all. On top of that, Stannis would either need to come back to King's Landing or give a good reason as to why he had left without a word to anyone, otherwise his position on the council would be replaced. Ned would much prefer for Stannis come back to King's Landing, as he felt he was one of the only members of the small council he could trust. If not, he had in mind a few choices of who could possibly replace the man. He also had a few ideas on decreasing the population of the city. Ideas that would add to the debt, if by a small amount, but would hopefully benefit the city and the realm. With Robert's promise to attend the next meeting, Ned went back to the Tower of the Hand. He was escorted by a few members of his personal guard, including Jory. Jory, I would like you to send some men into the city tomorrow. Have them wear plain garb so as to not be identified with myself or the crown, and have them talk to the people. I would like an idea of what the people are saying, and what they think. It should be done, my lord, Jory said with a slight bow. With that taken care of, Ned trudged his way up the stairs and to his room so he could finally go to bed. Chapter 8, Robb 3. Robb 3. Ignoring the men, though boys might be a more apt description, who trained nearby under Sir Roderick's watchful eye, Robb swung the great sword into the practice dummy. It wasn't that powerful of a swing, but the Valyrian steel was sharp and cut deep into the burlap bag stuffed with straw that made up the body of the dummy, burying into the wood of the stand that held it, and with a tug came out just as easily as it went in. Ice was the ancestral blade of the Starks, and though normally wielded by the head of the family, his father had left it behind in Winterfell and had instructed Robb to train with it. Ice melts in the warmer temperatures that fill the south, his father had said as to why he was leaving it behind. Rob imagined his father was thinking of the fates of his own father and brother, and perhaps wanted to leave ice where it belonged should the same fate somehow befall him. Not that Rob thought his namesake would allow anything of the like to happen, but his father had also told him it was better to be prepared for the unfortunate to befall you, than for the unfortunate to befall you and you not be prepared. Despite being almost twice the size of the swords he had trained with, and the longsword he had been gifted on his 14th name-a-day, Rob found ice to be surprisingly light. Valyrian steel was an almost mythical metal made by Valyrian sorcerers with the use of dragon fire and magics forgotten by man after the doom of Valyria. Rob's biggest problem with the blade was that, despite its light weight, it required two hands to wield properly, which meant no shield to use to defend himself. Although he had spent some of his youth learning to wield a great sword, it was less than a quarter of the time he spent with longsword and shield, and so a new type of weapon meant learning a new way to attack and defend. On his next swing Rob overextended himself and nearly fell flat on his face. It didn't help that ice was nearly as long as he was tall. Hopefully he would continue to grow so wielding the weapon would come easier to him. His father was exactly 6 feet tall. At the moment Rob was 4 inches short of that, and hoped to at least be eye level with his father when he was done growing. He had spent most of the day in the Wolfswood, overseeing the building of the road to the Crofters village from Winterfell. There was already a well-traveled dirt path that connected the two, and the day had been spent clearing away the trees and brush along the sides of that dirt path to widen it so 2 wagons could pass each other with ease. Overseeing work might be one of the most boring things Rob had ever done, and he had sat through Maester Lewin's lessons on the basic contract between lords and their small folk. He had been so bored at one point that he had grabbed an axe and helped fell some trees. It was hard, tiring work, but it felt better than just sitting on his horse doing nothing but looking on. He wondered how other lords could spend so much time doing nothing but sitting there and watching while others did all the work. Grinding the tree stumps of the fallen trees was tedious work that would take all afternoon, and was when Rob had left to go back to Winterfell. All of the fallen trees were stripped of their branches, which were gathered, broken into smaller pieces, and bundled for kindling, while the trunks were hauled off to the nearest lumber yards. Tomorrow, as another section of the dirt road was widened, men would be laying flat, thick stone along the cleared section. The process would repeat itself for many turns of the moon, the road turning north to the abandoned tower that his father was looking to restore, before curving back west to head to the coast and deep wood moat that sat along the shore. He would likely spend most of his mornings over the next sennight or so overseeing the work on the road. After that, the men would be too far from Winterfell for Rob to make the trip there and back within the same morning, and he didn't want to spend full days on the endeavor. At that point it would be up to Donal Lightfoot, a distant cousin of Lord Lightfoot of Whitehall who had been tasked with overseeing the work, to make sure the project went smoothly. As the men got near Lord Glover's men, Rob would be notified and he would ride out to meet with Lord Glover and hold a little ceremony over the completion of the road. The ceremony wouldn't be much, just a few words to reiterate the loyalty between the houses, and a small feast for the men who had labored for sennights. He was hoping Jon would be back from Castle Black by then to accompany him when that happened, as it would be a few days' ride and he'd rather be in some familiar company besides Theon. "All right lads, that's enough for the day," Sir Roderick shouted. These were the men, 27 in all, who would eventually be joining the castle guard. They wore beat-up leather armor that was so old it was starting to crack, and held wooden training swords in their dominant hands. Most of them looked only a few years older than Rob himself, and were likely the second or third sons of nearby farmers who weren't going to inherit much but didn't want to join the Night's Watch. None of them knew how to wield a sword when they had shown up, and even after a few sennights most were still terrible at it. They might have better luck with spears or maybe an axe. Rob would make the suggestion to Sir Roderick, not that the man wasn't likely already thinking the same thing. He was the master-at-arms of Winterfell for a reason, after all. But Rob knew of his father's, and Sir Roderick's, preference for the house guard to be trained with sword and shield. If the training of the new guard was done for the day, then that meant that dinner was soon approaching. Rob decided to call it a day as well. He sheathed the family greatsword and wiped the sweat from his brow. It was at that moment that Grey Wind came bounding out of the Godswood, tongue lolling out of his mouth, with the same impeccable timing he always seemed to have. Not for the first time Rob wondered if he and his direwolf had some type of deeper connection he was not fully aware of. Too often Grey Wind seemed to be aware when Rob was finished with training, or done with a meeting or some other task, and came to be by his side without being called. The direwolf woke when he woke, and was never far from where Rob was, no matter what Rob did or where he went. He wondered if any of his siblings were experiencing the same thing with their direwolves. He hadn't noticed the other direwolves doing the same with Arya and Rickon, but he was so busy as the acting Lord of Winterfell, that he barely saw his siblings outside of meals, and the occasional morning he still joined them for lessons. He would have to speak to one of his siblings to see, though his pickings were slim at the moment. Rickon was too young to understand, and the last thing any of them needed was Arya not knowing anything of it and trying to become more wolf-like to try to build a connection with Nymeria. She already displayed an overwhelming amount of what his father called wolf blood behavior. No one wanted or needed for her to display more. It was another conversation he'd save for when Jon was back. Together, he and Grey Wind made their way up to his room, where he rested ice against the wall by his desk. When he was done growing and carrying the sword was less awkward for him, he would bring the sword with him wherever he went, like his father often did. He would carry it across his back, the hilt peeking over his shoulder as a reminder to all who looked at him of its presence, and when the time came that he had need of it, to dispense justice as he had seen his father do dozens of times, he would easily pull it from his back. It would be a different approach from his father, who had others carry ice for him when he rode to take someone's head, but as much as he wanted to be like his father, he also knew he had to do things to separate himself. Until the time he was big enough to make his dream a reality, he would leave the great sword in his room, where the door was always locked when he and Winifred were not in it, and a pair of guards were stationed nearby. With the sword stashed, he grabbed some clothes to take to the baths. As he approached the door, it opened before him, and there stood Wyn, as he had taken to calling her. Her face was flushed and she had a smile Rob could only describe as predatory on her face. "Grey Wind, give us some privacy." The direwolf looked at Rob, as if understanding what was being asked of him and asking if that's what Rob truly wanted. "Go on, Grey Wind," Rob said, trying not to let the confusion he felt enter into his voice. "You can wait outside." Grey Wind moved out of the room and Wyn closed the door behind the direwolf. She locked the door and turned to Rob. "I was hoping to catch you before dinner." "Oh?" Rob asked, curious as to why she was looking for him. She shrugged off the light cloak she wore and pulled at the strings behind her neck, that tied her dress together. As the fabric started slipping down her shoulders, Rob's eyes widened. "Oh." Rob knew where she was going with this. He was pulling off his boots when Wyn crashed into him, her lips meeting his. They fell backwards onto the bed, Rob still fully clothed and the boot still on his left foot, but neither of them cared. It would all be removed in short enough time. Outside their door, Grey Wind laid on the ground and placed his paws over his snout. A sennight later Rob watched as another tree was felled. The work had curved north from the Crofters village and was working its way north to the fallen tower that Bran had dubbed Tumbledown Tower on one of their forays through the Wolfswood with their father. The previous name of the tower had been lost to history, and so the family had taken to calling it Tumbledown Tower for lack of a better name. He had been accompanied today by Winifred and her sister Wyler, as well as Theon. Most of the morning had already passed. Theon had stayed at his side as they watched the work being done, though he entertained himself by occasionally picking targets in the woods to shoot his bow at. Grey Wind had also stayed at his side, spending most of the morning laying down in the brush. Wyn and Wyler had grown bored and had taken to examining the forest around them. This was going to be the last morning he came out to oversee the work, even though there was about another sennight left. He could realistically still ride out for the mornings, as he felt there were more important things for himself to be doing. For instance, Lady Mormont had written back agreeing to the fostering of her 2 daughters at Winterfell. That Raven had arrived several days ago, which meant the Mormonts were already on their way. In fact, they had probably already landed at Deepwood Motte and would soon be making their way on the same path the workers were working to turn into the Wolf's Road. While his mother would make sure rooms were arranged and the various servants were aware of their new guests, both short-term and long-term, Rob felt it would be his duty to talk with Sir Roderick and Horlis Mollin to make sure the guards were aware and that they would do their duty in not just protecting House Stark but the Mormont daughters as well. The men would likely be stopping to eat their midday meal soon, and Rob thought it the perfect time to head back to Winterfell. He tried to stretch his back, to try to work out the knot that had formed from his unconscious slumping in the saddle after so long sitting idle, but the knot still remained. He pulled the reins and turned his horse in a circle and looked around him. Theon was still there, and off to the side was the handful of guards who had accompanied them, but he could not find his wife or his sister. "Where is Win?" he asked Theon. Theon turned and looked around, before giving a half shrug. "She was here a few minutes ago. They probably saw a pretty bird and wandered out a bit following it. You know how girls are." Rob grunted in answer. He had two sisters who were complete opposites of each other. He definitely knew how girls were. "Grey Wind." The direwolf rose from its prone position and approached Rob. Both horses shifted uneasily at the closeness of the beast. Rob looked down into Grey Wind's golden eyes and held the direwolf's gaze. "Find Win." Grey Wind cocked his head to the side before turning from Rob. He sniffed at the air for a moment, turning his head this way and that before he took off running through the trees. "Follow him!" Rob cried, spurring his horse. Theon cursed, kicking his horse in its side and steering it after Rob, who had already jumped through the brush to chase his direwolf. They galloped through the trees, the horses dodging around trees as they ducked low-hanging branches, well beyond the sight of the men working on the road. With a start, Rob realized he forgot to tell the few house guards who had accompanied them for protection of what they were doing. Hopefully the guards had enough sense to follow after getting over the initial shock of his departure. Rob, Theon, and Grey Wind came to a stop at the edge of a clearing that was bisected by a creek, where Winifred and Wyler sat atop their horses surrounded by 6 people, 4 men and 2 women. 4 of them wore furs but 2 of the men wore the black of the Night's Watch. The men of the Night's Watch held swords. The taller woman held a spear, one of the other men held an axe, and the last 2 each held dirks of rusty metal. "Deserters and wildlings," Theon muttered. Rob pulled ice from its sheath and urged his horse into the clearing. "Drop your weapons or die upon them," Rob commanded, doing his best to put on a lord's voice, like he heard his father use so often. Everyone looked at him but Rob only had eyes for Win. She looked scared but unharmed, which was a relief. He looked over Wyler and saw the same. Knowing the status of his wife and good sister allowed him to shift his focus to the others, the threats. "The husband," said a man with a grey stubbly face. "He's a fierce one he is," said one of the women, the shorter one. "You mean to fight us, boy?" "Don't be a fool, lad, you're 1 against 6, said the taller woman. "Throw down your sword and get off your horse. We'll thank you kindly for the mount, and you, your wife, and her sister can be on your way." Rob whistled. Grey Wind jumped into the clearing, teeth bared. Theon entered as well, hands off the reins as he had his bow drawn tight, using his legs to steer his horse. "A wolf," the short woman gasped. "A direwolf," Wyler said, her voice quavering. If what they could find on direwolves in the Winterfell library was true, Grey Wind still had a long way to go before he was fully grown. That didn't mean he wasn't already a considerable size. Already barely over 8 months old, Grey Wind had outgrown every hound at Winterfell and was just a bit shy of the size of a standard wolf. "A dog," one of the men, the one with the dirk, said contemptuously. "Yet I'm told there's nothing like a wolfskin cloak to keep a man warm at night." "Take." Whatever else the man was going to say was interrupted by the arrow that slammed into his chest, forcing whatever air was left in his lungs out of his mouth. His free hand grabbed at the arrow as his legs gave out from under him and he collapsed to the ground. "Winterfell!" Rob shouted, though he didn't know why, clumsily holding ice with one hand. One of the men stupidly charged at Rob, but he was met with a downward swing of ice. There wasn't a ton of force behind the swing, since Rob was not used to wielding it one-handed from horseback, but it didn't matter. The man crumpled in a spray of blood. Another of the men, one of the deserters, grabbed a hold of the reins of Rob's horse and raised his sword, but before he could do anything Grey Wind had set upon him. Both deserter and direwolf tumbled along the ground and into the creek, where the water turned red with blood. Theon knocked another arrow and just missed the squat woman, who had made a move toward Win and Wyler. Rob met the tall woman with ice, and her with her spear. He parried her strikes, noting that she was very skilled with the weapon. If he had his regular longsword on him then he would feel much better about this fight. "Ride!" Theon shouted at Win and Wyler, who had sat staring with wide eyes. His shout shook them from their stupor. They urged their horses forward, The last of the men, the largest of them who carried the axe, grabbed onto Win's leg, but she was able to yank herself from the man's grasp. As Win and Wyler galloped from the clearing, Theon pulled another arrow from his quiver, realizing it was one of only two left. He aimed it at the large man with the axe, deeming him the biggest threat left. The squat woman made to charge at Theon, and so he shifted his aim, let out his breath and let the arrow fly. It pierced through the woman's neck and she fell like a sack of potatoes. Rob managed to knock away the spear of the woman he fought, and jerked on the reins of his horse. The animal followed his commands, spinning on the spot and slamming his hindquarters into the woman. She fell to the ground hard, the spear tumbling from her grasp as her hands wrapped protectively around her ribs. He turned to Theon, who was pulling his final arrow out of his quiver, and the large wildling with the axe who advanced on him. Before anything else could happen, the sound of hooves were heard as the house guards burst into the clearing. The one in the lead was able to thrust his sword into the wildling man's chest before he could react to what was happening. Grey Wind emerged from the creek, soaking wet and his muzzle stained with red. He walked up to one of the dead bodies and started to sniff it, as if deciding if he was still hungry. The deserter he had tumbled into the creek with was a mangled corpse. "Where were you?" Rob shouted, looking at the 6 men who had entered the clearing. "My lord, we came as soon as we..." "Why did none of you follow my wife when she first wandered off?" Rob demanded, cutting the guard off. "You are supposed to guard her as much as you guard me, if not more so, but not one of you thought to follow her. Why did it take you so long to come upon us here in this clearing?" The guards all looked at each other, their faces red with shame. 5 of them were in the clearing, which hopefully meant the other 3 were with Win and Wyler. Rob wanted to cuss them all out until the sun began to set, but he would leave that to Hollis and Sir Roderick when they were back at Winterfell. He would make sure the Master-at-Arms and Captain of the Guard punished the men appropriately upon their return. "What do we do with this one?" Theon asked, moving his horse closer to the downed wildling woman Rob had fought, the only one still alive. "Mercy, Lord," the woman cried, slowly climbing to her feet, one hand still wrapped protectively around her ribs. "Give me my life, Lord of Stark, and I am yours." Win and Wyler came back into the clearing, with the 3 remaining house guards following behind them. "What would I want with an oathbreaker?" Rob asked. "I broke no oaths. Stiv and Wallin flew off the wall, not me. The Black Crows have no place for women." "Give her to the wolf," Theon suggested. Grey Wind had taken to eating the corpse of the squat woman. All who looked upon the sight quickly looked away, stomachs queasy. "She's a woman," Rob muttered, "sheathing ice." "A wildling," Win said. "She was the only one who advocated for keeping us alive. She wanted to bring us to someone named Mance Rayder, for ransom." Rob took that information in as he regarded the dirty and disheveled woman in front of him. He had heard the name Mance Rayder before, but he couldn't quite place it. Maybe in a conversation between his father and Uncle Benjen when his uncle had been here during the king's visit. "Do you have a name, wildling?" "Osha, if it please Ord," the wildling said, sourly. "Take Osha with us," Rob commanded, pointing at her. "We will decide her fate at Winterfell." 2 of the guards came down from their horses, and approached Osha. They pulled her to her feet, and she yelped in pain from whatever injury she had sustained in their fight. Rob climbed down from his own horse and picked up the spear Osha had fought with. It was black and must have been 6.5 feet long, with a pointed bronze tip at the end. The weapon looked well made, which was more than Rob expected from a wildling. He wondered briefly if the former owner had been killed, but figured it didn't matter now. He climbed back onto his horse, holding the spear in his offhand as he took the reins with the other. "What about the others?" one of the guards asked, gesturing at the 5 dead bodies. For the first time, Rob realized he had killed a man. It was only the one, a man whose face had been sliced open to the bone, but it was still his first kill. He felt lightheaded and did his best to keep from swaying in the saddle. Thankfully his morning meal had been hours ago, otherwise he would be fighting it back down as it threatened to come up. "Take the head of the 2 deserters and send them to the Night's Watch so they know of their fate," Rob said, his voice sounding calmer than he felt. "Leave everything else to the carrion." Chapter 9, Jon 3. Jon 3. A few days after they had arrived at Castleback, Uncle Benjen was sent on a ranging. Jon had asked about the ranging, curious as to what it entailed, but his uncle wouldn't give him too many details, likely because it was watch business. All his uncle said was that rangers had been disappearing on the recent trips beyond the wall, and it was his job as first ranger to look into the disappearances. John had been looking forward to spending some more time with his uncle, who he only saw once every few years, but it looked like fate had other plans. With his uncle gone, and Tyrion using his charm to try to win over the Lord Commander, John found himself in search of others to spend time with. In spite of himself, and his silent vow to keep away, John found himself drawn to the training of the new brothers of the Night's Watch during his stay at Castle Black. A lot of them were teens and young men, between his own age and several years older. Lord Commander Mormont had ordered Sir Alisa to allow John to participate in the yard, so even though the bitter man spent the majority of the time making spiteful comments about John and his parentage, he reluctantly allowed John in the training yard. It was clear to John that few of the recruits actually knew how to fight, and those that did were not near the level of himself. That was evident on the first day when he had beaten every single one of them in practice fights, even taking on 3 at once at one point. He had almost broken the hand of a lumbering recruit named Gren, which had led to a confrontation that John had been able to de-escalate before it broke into violence. "No, hold it like this." John adjusted the fat young man's grip on the sword, for what felt like the 100th time. "It's no use," Samwell Tarly whined. John had to resist the urge to roll his eyes. Sam was overweight and a craven, something he readily admitted to. It was mystifying how a man with the reputation of Randil Tarly could sire a son like Sam. No matter how many times John tried to teach him how to fight with a sword, the teen could never seem to pick it up. It was like he purposefully forgot everything he was taught when it came to weapons training. "I don't know why you decided to join the Night's Watch, but if you're going to say your vows you're going to need to know at least the basics of fighting," John said. "My uncle told me even the stewards and builders have to man the wall should the wildlings attack." Sam was only one of a few who John worked with, but he was the one that needed the most help. The others he had taken to training, Piper, Halder, and Gren, who had joined their group after getting over his initial anger at John, had all tried to talk John out of training Samwell Tarly, or Sir Piggy as Thorne had taken to calling the lad, but John had seen teaching Sam to fight as a challenge. Yet after a week, there didn't seem to be any improvement. And it wasn't for lack of intelligence either. Sam was smarter than John was and probably read almost as many books as Lord Tyrion did, but for whatever reason he could never retain the information John and Sir Alisa were trying to instill into him when it came to sword fighting. There had to be some hidden reason the information wasn't sticking. "There's no hidden reason," Gren grunted when John had spoken with the others about his musings. "He's just a craven. He'll never be a crow at this rate," PYP said. "If you're so fond of him, you should take him home with you. He can share the floor with Ghost." "He'll be a crow," John said, his voice low. "The Night's Watch needs all the men it can get, even one like Sam." "Of course they do, they took PYP didn't they?" Halder said, slapping the smaller teen on the back. So here John stood trying to teach Sam how to properly hold and wield a sword, again, and failing miserably at it, again. John encouraged Sam to attack him, and the teen did so with half-hearted swings. "Stop with this half-assed nonsense and attack me with everything you have." Sam put some more effort into it, but it was still rather pathetic. John inwardly sighed as he easily deflected the attacks. "Stop with the large swings. All it does is let your opponent know what you're doing and waste energy. Your strikes should be short and controlled." John went on the offensive and demonstrated what he meant. With one strike he knocked the training sword out of Sam's hand, and with a second one he smacked the flat of his own training sword against Sam's side with a meaty thwack. The fat teen cried out in pain, and grabbed at his side. John had pulled up on his swing so it wouldn't hurt that much. Still, even with the leather and furs that protected the recruits, he knew it would sting. That was the point. "What was that for?" Sam asked, his voice quivering. "You aren't taking this seriously." "I am too." "No you aren't." John's patience had worn thin. "If you were, I wouldn't have to show you how to properly hold a sword every morning. If you aren't going to put effort into being a brother of the Night's Watch, why don't you just go back home to your soft Southern life?" The other recruits, at least those closest to them, who occupied the training yard, turned at the outburst. Sir Alisa, who was nearby, gave Jon the nastiest smirk he had ever seen, as if saying to Jon, "You're starting to sound like me." The thought made Jon shiver. "I can't go back," Sam murmured, tears in his eyes. "My father will kill me." That caught Jon off guard. He was well aware of all the eyes that were on them. Jon grabbed Sam and, with effort, dragged him away from the rest of the recruits. He grabbed Sam by the shoulders and looked him in the eye, doing his best to imitate his father's lord face. "Tell me everything." And so Sam did. About how he had been into sweets and music and books as a child, and had failed at every attempt his father had tried in making him into the type of son worthy of Randall Tarly. The hate, disappointment, and ridicule his father heaped upon him every day for being a failure of an heir. When Sam was 10 years old, his father had turned his attention to his younger brother Daikon, who was 4 at the time, and worked to turn him into the man Sam would never be. When it became obvious that Daikon would become the type of man Randall Tarly wanted in an heir, something needed to be done with his actual heir. "He told me if I didn't take the black, I'd suffer an unfortunate hunting accident," Sam confessed through his tears. "The last thing he said to me when I set out was that if I ever came back, he'd kill me himself." Between Tyrion and Sam, Jon was starting to realize he might be a bastard, but at least his father was Eddard Stark, and not Tywin Lannister or Randall Tarly. At least in that regard he had lucked out. "Listen to me, Sam,"